Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good afternoon. The first item of business is portfolio questions. The first portfolio is Justice and Law Officers. It's question 1, which is Jackie Baillie, please. Miss Baillie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when the Crown Office will release its findings from the investigation into the fatal fire at Cameron House in December 2017.
Lord Advocate.
This is a live investigation which is continuing under the direction of a Senior Advocate Depute. Like other incidents of this sort, it involves technical issues which require input from relevant experts. A decision as to whether or not there should be a prosecution can be made only once final reports have been submitted to the Crown by Police Scotland and other regulatory and investigating agencies. Upon receipt, those reports will be considered fully and carefully by prosecutors. That stage has not yet been reached. The Crown continues to keep the families of the deceased updated.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the Lord Advocate for his response, but I'm sure he will appreciate it has been almost 2 years since the fire at Cameron House, which claimed the lives of Simon Midgley and Richard Dyson. The families have been patient, and of course we want to give you sufficient time to investigate, but could you give us any indication of when you are likely to arrive at a conclusion?
Lord Advocate.
I appreciate the impact that the passage of time in relation to investigations, both criminal investigations and death investigations, have on those involved, and particularly bereaved families. The member will appreciate that it is essential that the criminal investigative process be allowed to take its course. A decision will be made just as soon as it is possible to do so.
Question 2, Margaret Mitchell.
To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to support police in tackling drug use at football grounds.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Yusuf.
The Scottish Government has invested £800 million to tackle the problem of alcohol and drug use since 2008. A programme for government, as the member will be aware, announced last week, commits a further £20 million over the next 2 years to support local services, provide targeted support and raise awareness of the dangers of drug use. Police Scotland will continue to work with football clubs to investigate any drug misuse at matches, and is also committed to including ensuring people involved in drug dealing and distribution are very effectively targeted for arrest and prosecution. We want Scotland's football grounds to be welcoming places for everybody, including families and children. The Scottish Government is working with the football authorities, clubs and other partners to address some of the negative issues we've seen in recent months, including reported drug misuse. We fully support clubs in their efforts to deal with any such behaviour which is illegal and contravenes the grounds regulations. The use of sniffer dogs by Hibs is just one example of the positive action clubs can take to deter illegal activity and unacceptable conduct. While the allocation of prioritisation of resources is obviously a matter for the Chief Constable, the Scottish Government's funding for policing 2019-20 has increased by £42.3 million.
I don't want to sort of interfere too much with Cabinet Secretary's position, but if we could have slightly shorter answers, we'll make greater progress through the questions, because I'm very hard on members. Margaret Mitchell.
Yeah. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but he will be aware that this is a growing problem, and recent reports of cocaine drug use have been highlighted in Hamilton, Easter Road, Pittodrie, Celtic and Ibrox. Given that we know that drug use and drug taking is an aggravating, likely to increase hooliganism and antisocial behaviour at football games, can he release some more details about the talks he's had with clubs and the effort that is going in to identify, reduce and deter fans from using drugs? Because the
please, that's
the
sufficient.
evidence of cocaine is clearly
your question's
there,
been asked.
and also
Thank you.
about extra.
I do want to get
intense
members, Ms Mitchell, I do want to get members in.
sniffer dog use.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm happy to have a conversation with Margaret Mitchell. Of the clubs she's talked about, I've met a number of them, Aberdeen, Celtic, Hibs. Really only this issue has been raised with me by Celtic and Hibs, and I know some of the proactive measures both clubs are taking. I'm continuing conversations with the clubs, so I'm more than happy to have a conversation with Margaret Mitchell or write to her if she feels appropriate about how those conversations are going. I just point to one quote from John Mackenzie, head of police, what was known as the Focus Unit. He said, "We do not have any analytical evidence that demonstrates a link between football disorder and the misuse of drugs, but Police Scotland works closely with supporters groups and clubs to tackle any issues." So on that note, as I say, I'm more than happy to furnish Margaret Mitchell with further details.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Iain Gray. Beg your pardon, I had indicated to Kenneth Gibson. It has to be brief, please. Supplementary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that alcohol still remains the drug of greatest concern at football matches, and what is his view as to whether or not alcohol should be available under certain restrictions at Euro 2020?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not convinced by the argument that alcohol should be available at football grounds as things stand, and I've been having detailed discussions with a number of stakeholders around some of the unacceptable conduct that we've seen at football, and I'm not convinced, again, that introducing alcohol into the mix, even under some very restricted circumstances, beyond what is currently available at grounds, is a good idea.
Iain Gray.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will ensure the restoration of the throughcare service for people leaving prison.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Iain Gray for a really important question. The decision by the SPS to temporarily suspend their throughcare support service, of course, is an operational matter, and rightly a decision for SPS to make. But as SPS have made it clear, this is not a decision that anybody has taken lightly. It's a decision that's taken very reluctantly. And only done so because these experienced officers are required for duties within prison because of, unfortunately, the high prison population that we currently see. It should be said that they indicated this service has been suspended, not stopped. In the meantime, other work will continue with the prison service to help individuals prepare for the release, such as the work of personal officers, prison link centres and individual case management activity. There is, of course, other through care support that the government funds, so we provide substantial funding to the third sector investing £3.4 million in namely the Shine programme and the New Routes programme. These services have built an excellent track record. My officials and myself, I'm in discussions with the leaders of these third sector organisations, with SPS, and we're going to consider how the third sector might be able to come in to temporarily support the work that's been left by SPS making this decision for understandable but very difficult reasons, and I hope to be able to update Iain Gray and other members in the relatively near future on how that work will progress.
Iain Gray.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply, but it's not really good enough to say that this is an operational decision for SPS. The creation of throughcare services was very much a policy decision driven by ministers in the past. I appreciate that our prisons are currently operating at around 5% over capacity, and that is the reason that SPS have given for bringing these officers back in to the prisons. But given the importance of throughcare in reducing reoffending rates, will the Cabinet Secretary not agree that SPS is cutting off its nose to spite his face here, and he should get them to change their mind?
Cabinet Secretary, I'm sorry, but briefly.
Look, I appreciate the question, and I don't disagree with his premise that, of course, throughcare support workers do an excellent job, and through their work they can reduce reoffending. So I don't disagree with him on that sentiment. Where I would slightly disagree with him is that, of course, if I was to overturn an operational decision by SPS, he and other opposition members would often be the first ones that would drag me here to say that I was interfering. So I need to be careful to give the Chief Executive the right operational space. That is not an excuse. I think I've also highlighted in my answer that my government officials are working with SPS and third sector leaders to develop a proposal where the third sector might be able to come in to provide that throughcare support by expanding the New Routes programme, for example, expanding the Shine programme, to be able to fill that gap that's been left. And I will update Iain Gray and other members who may ask questions on this, and hopefully with a positive development in the not too distant future.
Liam MacArthur, and then followed by Liam Kerr. Both briefly, please.
Thank you very much. As the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged, throughcare has been suspended as a result of the rising prison population. Instead of expanding this progressive service, key to rehabilitation, the Cabinet Secretary has now presided over its suspension. What are the current projections for the prison population over the next 12 months? And assuming an increase, what realistic prospect is there of throughcare being reinstated in the near future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as a temporary suspension, as I've said, my hope would be that the presumption against short sentences, which I know Liam MacArthur and his party supported, will see a reduction in the number of prisoners. That reduction may be relatively small, but a reduction nonetheless. But also through some of the other measures that we will look to bring forward. So, for example, as he knows, there will be a revision to the guidance around HDC as well. And there's been an understanding with the Justice Committee, I know, which Liam MacArthur sits, that perhaps the pendulum has swung slightly too far in the other direction around HDC. So there are a couple of measures that I think will help to reduce the prison population. But frankly speaking, that progressive agenda that we're bringing forward is going to have to be supported by this Parliament if we want to make a substantial dent in our prison population. So my confidence is that the suspension of the throughcare support will be temporary, but notwithstanding that, as I said in my answer to Iain Gray, even with a temporary suspension, we're quite keen to work with third sector and other partners to see how that gap may be able to be filled.
Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, Cabinet Secretary, I think we'd all agree it's vital that offenders are helped to get themselves free of illegal substances before leaving prison. But the latest figures show 26% of those leaving prison test positive for illegal drugs, which is up from 17% in 2009. Is the Scottish Government doing any analysis to find out why attempts to keep drugs out of prisons appear to be failing?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm happy for Liam Kerr to be put in touch with SPS and those that are dealing with this on the ground, but I think he'll probably be aware of the fact that in the last few years, certainly the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a huge spike in psychoactive substances, namely spice, but psychoactive substances entering into our prisons. The difficulty around psychoactive substances is their difficulty to detect. And therefore, there's a number of various solutions to that are being tested at the moment at the prison estate. For example, rapid scan machines and others. So we're at the stage of that equipment being piloted, I'm waiting for an evaluation to come back from SPS, and if there are, for example, capital funding requirements around that, then it's clearly an issue that government will have to look at very, very closely. But if Liam Kerr wants to follow that up with the prison service, I'm more than happy to facilitate those discussions.
Thank you. Question 4, Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the contact assessment model pilot.
Cabinet Secretary.
CAM is the new operating model for police call handling being introduced by Police Scotland. It's being introduced to enable Police Scotland to respond more effectively to vulnerability and demand, utilising a very robust approach to assessment of risk and vulnerability. Phase 1 implementation of CAM progressed on the 12th of June in Lanarkshire and Dumfries and Galloway. Police Scotland and the SPA indicate the Phase 1 implementation is proceeding positively. It's delivering benefits in terms of approved assessment of risk and service delivery. The SPA and Police Scotland intend to proceed with Phase 2 from late autumn this year. This will see the new model rolled out to Greater Glasgow. Implementation of CAM is overseen by the CAM Oversight Group, which is chaired by the SPA.
Jenny Gilruth.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. During recess, I was grateful to have the opportunity to learn more about the CAM pilot along with my colleague Rona Mackay at the Contact Command and Control Centre in Govan. And given that the CAM pilot had a 99% compliance rate, can the Cabinet Secretary provide more detail regarding when he expects the model to be rolled out nationally?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, she'll forgive me because clearly there's operational decisions around when that should be rolled out nationally. I'm delighted she came to my constituency in Govan and saw the CAM, the contact assessment model up close. I can confirm though, although the timing is a matter for Police Scotland, I can confirm that Police Scotland do intend to roll out CAM nationally. As I say, timescales for this are subject to all phases of implementation being completed successfully in accordance with the relevant assurance processes, and of course monitoring and evaluation each phase to ensure, of course, that there are no unintended consequences to what I think is a very good model. So, of course, Jenny Gilruth can contact Police Scotland directly. They'll be able to give us some more detail about the phasing, but I can confirm that there will be a national rollout of CAM.
James Kelly, briefly.
Given that adequate police resources are important for successful implementation of the contact assessment model, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he's concerned about the comments of Deputy Chief Constable Will Kerr that the current budget has a potential shortfall in police numbers of 700, and if that is the case, the consequence for resourcing CAM and adequate police cover in local communities is quite severe.
Cabinet Secretary.
What I would say to James Kelly, let me welcome him to his first Justice Portfolio questions, is I always take seriously what the police have to say to me, particularly somebody of the seniority of DCC Will Kerr. What I would say is that from when this government first came in 2007 to now, we have over 1,000 extra additional police officers. That's in sharp contrast to the picture in England and Wales. So we're continuing to invest in our police. We're continuing to increase the police numbers. What I would say is that the agreement with Police Scotland is that numbers can only ever be reduced if there is enhanced operational capability that is demonstrated, and that's overseen by HMICS. So therefore, if that can't be done, then there's a conversation to have with government. One is exactly as James Kelly is suggesting. SPA will rightly, as they undoubtedly will do with any government, request additional funds, or there has to be a deficit revision of the deficit reduction plan. So at the moment, we'll continue to engage positively with Police Scotland. I won't prejudge the spending review later this year. And the important point, though, is, of course, we have more police officers now than when we inherited power over 12 years ago.
Question 5, Ruth Maguire.
To ask the Scottish Government how the Justice Secretary's priorities in Equally Safe strategy will be supported by its programme for government.
Cabinet Secretary.
This year's PFG clearly sets out the Scottish Government's ongoing commitment to prevent and eradicate gender-based violence. Each action for the year ahead is aligned against one of their 4 priorities set out within the Equally Safe strategy. That includes actions to ensure that men desist from all forms of violence against women and girls. This year, the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 came into effect, and we will continue to support the implementation of this landmark legislation by engaging with those who work in housing, social work, health and schools to ensure that professionals have resources available to them to support a shared understanding of domestic abuse. Later this year, we'll introduce a Forensic Medical Services, Victims of Sexual Offences Bill, to promote early and consistent access to healthcare for victims of sexual assault. And we will support a pilot to visually record rape complainers' statements to police to be used as evidence later in a trial to reduce the need for them to recount their ordeal again in court.
Ruth Maguire.
I appreciate that answer. Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned Equally Safe Priority 4, that men desist from all forms of violence against women and girls, and perpetrators of such violence receive robust and effective responses. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how the Scottish Government intends to tackle human trafficking?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Ruth Maguire for an exceptionally important question. I should have paid credit to her in terms of the work that she's done to promote equally safe in this Parliament. Any form of human trafficking and exploitation, including sexual exploitation, is completely unacceptable in 21st century Scotland. I've been hugely impressed by working with not just my officials, but of course stakeholders involved in this work in terms of their commitment to eradicate human trafficking. There are still huge problems in and around human trafficking, not just in the UK, but indeed here in Scotland. That is evidenced by the referrals that come into the national referral mechanism. We know people are trafficked for a range of reasons. Labour exploitation for male victims has increased in recent years, but as Ruth Maguire suggests, we have to recognise the impact of trafficking for sexual exploitation can be particularly devastating. So we have a strategy. We are progressing some elements of the legislation which have not been progressed. We'll continue to support specialist funds, specialist support such as TARA, Migrant Help. But of course, if the member wishes a fuller answer on all the actions that we're progressing, then of course I'd be happy to write to the member.
Question 6, Lewis MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government in what circumstances the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service Gold Commanders are deployed.
Minister Ashton.
Operational decisions, including the deployment of Gold Commanders, are a matter for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Gold Commanders are deployed in a broad range of circumstances, such as all Level 5 incident types, spate conditions in a region or regions, large-scale incidents, serious incidents, and also major incidents.
Lewis, I'd like to call you first, Mr MacDonald. I know you're dead keen. We want to save time, but Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Does the Minister accept that current procedures mean that in the event of such a serious incident at St Fergus or on Royal Deeside or in Aberdeen, the Gold Commander in charge would be deployed no further north than Dundee? And if she does acknowledge that fact, would she agree that it is time for the centralisation of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to be brought to an end?
Minister, briefly please.
I thank the member for that question, and of course it is imperative that we have the right level of leadership for these type of major and large-scale incidents in place at the right time. So SFRS are constantly reviewing and planning the resource that's required for delivery of frontline services, and that of course would include also succession planning for senior leadership and so on. Gold Command officers have been mobilised approximately 14 times over the past 2 years. And I would like to reassure the member that there has never been a single occasion where SFRS have not responded with the required resources. But I will follow up with the member with more detail on the specific point that he raised.
Thank you. I'm afraid that has to conclude the first session of portfolio questions. I apologise to Maureen Watt. Despite my best efforts, Ms Watt, we failed to reach you. And we're going to move on to the second set in just a moment when the front benches change places. The second portfolio set of questions is on government business and constitutional relations. Can I remind members that questions 1 and 3 are grouped. Any member who wishes to ask a supplementary on either of these questions to press the request to speak buttons in the usual way. And I'll take these after I've taken questions and supplementaries from the members whose questions have been grouped. As usual, try to make your questions short, and can I beg ministers, I know it's difficult and I understand why, but to try and let everyone get in with their questions, you should be helpful too. Question 1, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how to ensure that it considers and takes actions on the recommendations made by the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland when it concludes its deliberations in April 2020.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
All recommendations made by the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland will be debated in this Parliament. Where the Parliament agrees with these recommendations, the Scottish Government will set out a plan for implementing the Parliament's decisions. That plan will be published by the Government within 3 months of the Assembly's recommendations having been received.
David Torrance.
I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary shares my observations of a stark contrast that exists now in the UK between the Scottish Government that is actively listening and acting upon the views of its citizens and the UK Government that is denying the people a voice by shutting down Parliament and preventing those elected the right to hold the Government to account.
Cabinet Secretary.
This afternoon, I think, will provide that contrast. We will be debating the Citizens' Assembly, I hope, in a constructive and consensual way, at the same time as the judges in the Inner House have indicated that the prorogation is illegal. And in those circumstances, what should be happening to parallel our positive step is that Westminster Parliament should immediately be recalled and the prorogation cancelled.
Question 3, Liz Smith.
To ask the Scottish Government what measures it is taking to ensure the impartiality of its planned Citizens' Assembly.
Cabinet Secretary.
I will be addressing this issue this afternoon in the debate that is to come, but can I just say that the Assembly is already led by 2 independent conveners, one of whom is a third sector leader, one of whom was a Scottish Labour member of the European Parliament for 35 years. The members of the Assembly will be selected in a scientific process that broadly represents the Scottish adult, that is 16+ population, taking into account a range of factors: geography, age, gender, ethnic group, educational qualifications, limiting long-term conditions, disability, attitudes towards independence, the UK's membership of the EU, Scottish Parliament voting preferences. And the contract for the recruitment of those members under that basis was awarded following a competitive procurement process.
Liz Smith.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, and he said when he introduced the idea of the Citizens' Assembly that they would be transparent, inclusive and independent. But his colleague Joanna Cherry MP said that the assemblies would, and I quote, be the perfect way to move Scotland towards independence. Cabinet Secretary, these 2 things do not sit together. Can I ask you which is correct?
Well,
Cabinet Secretary.
I am responsible in the Scottish Government for the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly. I have indicated to you what the position is of the Scottish Government on this matter. I know the member is addressing me as a Minister of the Scottish Government. I hope she will take my assurance as the person involved in this. I am determined to make sure this is an independent body, and I have taken many steps to do so, more of which I shall outline this afternoon. This will be a totally, fully independent body, which will set its own terms, which will choose the way in which it operates, and will report in a fully independent way. The member and I know each other for many years. I hope she will accept my assurances on that matter.
Question 2, Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress is, what progress it has made on fully What progress it has made on fully implementing the recommendations in the Scottish Information Commissioner's intervention report on its FOI practice and performance.
Minister Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, the Commissioner published his annual progress report on the Scottish Government's implementation of the Action Plan on the 29th of July. In it, he outlines the significant progress made across each recommendation and confirms he anticipates the Government will complete implementation by the end of the current calendar year.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you. And just to confirm then, Minister, are you comfortable the Government will complete the action plan by the end of this year?
Presiding Officer, a great deal of time and effort has gone in not only to improve performance but also to embed change. So the answer in short is yes, I am.
I'd like to hear answers in short. Question 4, Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its anticipated timescale is for the progress of a Scottish elections reform bill.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Elections Reform Bill was introduced to Parliament on the 2nd of September 2019. The bill's timetable thereafter, of course, is a matter for the Parliamentary Bureau.
Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank him for his answer there? This Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee, of which I'm a member, is presently dealing with the referendums bill and will likely have to deal with the franchise and electoral reform bills as well. So has the Scottish Government seriously considered how all 3 of these will be passed at least 6 months before the next scheduled Scottish Parliament election, taking into account the Gould principle?
Minister.
Presiding officer, with the greatest respect to the member, I think he presumes something there. It's a matter for the Bureau to allocate any bill to whatever committee it's relevant to do so. But what I would do is give him an assurance that as a Minister for Parliamentary Business, one of the considerations I always have in bringing forward legislation is the workload of committees and to ensure they have sufficient time in order to interrogate any bills that are brought forward. And sitting next to him is Mr Mountain, who I'm sure would concur that when a committee such as his has requested additional time to allow them to carry out the work, I've been receptive to that.
Question 5, Alistair Allen.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the impact on Scotland of constitutional developments in the House of Commons.
Cabinet Secretary.
President Officer, no one should underestimate the significance of events at Westminster. By his prorogation, the Prime Minister used a prerogative power to remove from MPs a decision on how many days the Commons would sit before the 31st of October. The prorogation of over 30 days is significantly longer than any prorogation in modern times, and the Court's decision today in Scotland reflects upon that. The Prime Minister took these steps preemptively before the Commons had returned from recess, presenting MPs with a fait accompli. All of these factors, the use of executive powers to deny MPs a voice, the discarding of recent commonly accepted practice, the denial of any opportunity to challenge or scrutinise government action, should give all of us grave cause for concern. It is no surprise that these actions of the Prime Minister galvanised opposition in the Commons to come together to prevent a no-deal Brexit, actions with which the Scottish Government completely agrees.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary. In a week of astonishing constitutional events, none can top the Court of Session's ruling this morning that the Prime Minister acted unlawfully in proroguing the UK Parliament. The Court said, I quote, "It was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing Parliament." Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that Downing Street sources would be advised now to spend more time preparing for the recall of Parliament and less time making outrageous remarks about Scotland's judges and judicial system?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, and I have to say, and I do this speculatively, but I think he is agreeing with me. I know that, for example, Mr Tompkins has indicated his disagreement with, well, he uses the word outrageous, and I would, for once, agree with him completely. The Downing Street remarks, in which sources in number 10 suggested the legal activist chose the Scottish courts for a reason, is an outrageous thing to say. Gavin Barwell, I think now Lord Barwell, Theresa May's Chief of Staff, said this is an unwise road for a party that believes in the Union and the rule of law to go down. And Robert Buckland, the UK Justice Secretary, eventually tweeted, "Our judges are renowned around the world for their excellence and impartiality. I have total confidence in their independence in every case." The member is right. The right reaction to this is to recall Parliament. If I may use a song title from the estimable band Pete and Diesel from the member's own constituency, that this may be the way the Tories do it, but it's not the way we do it in Scotland, let alone the Western Isles.
Question 6, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government when it last spoke to the UK Government regarding intergovernmental relations.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this morning is the answer to the question that has been asked. I met Oliver Dowden, the Paymaster General and Minister for the Cabinet Office. The last ministerial meeting to take place was the quadrilateral with the Finance Ministers on the 29th of August. My colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work, discussed the governance in terms of reference for that forum with UK and Welsh Government ministers. The last ministerial discussion where the ongoing quadrilateral review of intergovernmental relations was on the agenda was a JMC-EN on the 28th of June. There is a meeting of the JMC-EN tomorrow, and the new Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union will co-chair that meeting.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply, and does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the intergovernmental relations with the UK Government is broken and that the attempts to formalise a respect agenda are continually rebuked by a disrespected UK Government, and clearly the best way to have a respect agenda would be for Scotland to become an independent nation and to formalise relations as equals?
Cabinet Secretary.
I could not disagree with a single word of that, but I also think it is important for the UK Government, even in its present confused state, to recognise that the procedures and relationships are not simply in the gift of the UK government. I had occasion to say to the Paymaster General this morning that whilst they may wish to change the ways in which the intergovernmental review is discussed, for example by doing it by trilateral rather than through the JMC Iain, that is a matter for all the participants, not just for one participant. I think he took the point, but it is an important point and has been emphasised by Mark Drakeford as well. The JMC process does not belong to the UK government, and the more it behaves as if it does, the harder it will be to make any progress.
Question 7, Jeremy Balfour.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what advice it has received on the effect that the legal date of the UK's exit from the EU will have on its continuity bill.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as members are aware, the Scottish Ministerial Code states that ministers must not ordinarily divulge either the source or content of legal advice. Legal advice is confidential. It's a very long-established convention that legal advice provided to the Scottish Government is not published, and the Government does not disclose the source of advice. On the issue of the question, apart from legal advice, the Scottish Government is determined to respect the choices this Parliament made when passing the Continuity Bill to the maximum extent possible. Therefore, the new bill will bring back provisions to ensure Scots law may continue to keep pace with EU law, as we believe that the extent to which devolved law aligns itself with the law of the EU should be a decision for this Parliament to take, not the UK Government. The bill is also intended to maintain the role of environmental principles and effective and proportionate environmental governance after EU exit.
Jeremy Balfour.
Can I thank the Minister for his answer? The Supreme Court ruled that the SNP's previous bill was largely incompetent, and the independent judiciary, which we all support in this chamber, made the decision that the SNP had refused to accept this. When the new bill is introduced, will it meet the criteria set out by the court?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would advise the member to go and read the judgment. I don't understand where his interpretation comes from. The Supreme Court judgment was very clear, with one very small exception, The reality in terms of this bill, the Continuity Bill, was that it was competent for the Parliament to pass this. But of course what happened is the UK Tory government, a government which the member supports, chose to change the law after this Parliament had voted for that bill in order to try and stymie the intention of this Parliament. That perhaps gave us a hint as to what was to come in terms of prorogation, because Tories of all shapes do not seem willing to consider democracy above all. Now, I don't think the member would want to support that, so perhaps he should read the judgment again, and then he might like to correct the record of what he has actually said this afternoon.
Question 8, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with the UK Government regarding the status of EU nationals who are resident in Scotland.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, ending free movement will significantly reduce the rights that EU citizens in Scotland currently enjoy. The Minister for Europe, Migration and International Development met with the former Immigration Minister Caroline Oakes multiple times this year to discuss the rights of EU citizens in Scotland and to express concerns about the UK Government's EU settlement scheme. He has also raised concerns in writing with the new Home Office Ministers and requested a meeting, and will continue to press the UK Government to properly safeguard the rights of EU citizens in Scotland.
Linda Fabiani.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? And can I presume that the Scottish Government has noted the number of EU nationals who are being refused settled status, with the UK Government trying to justify this by suggesting that pre-settled status is not in fact a refusal? However, that creates great uncertainty and gives people no security whatsoever. Can I ask that at the next meeting with the UK Government, the Minister raises in the strongest terms this issue and denounces this nonsense very, very strongly indeed, because it's causing huge stress to many EU nationals, both in my own constituency of East Kilbride and right across the country. These are people who have lived here for decades and who up until now considered Scotland their home.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, can I associate myself with much of what Linda Fabiani has said there? And she is right to air this issue. I recognise entirely as a constituency MSP some of the matters that she's described there. And can I say, Presiding Officer, the stress and the emotional toll that's exacted on our friends and neighbours who've chosen Scotland as their home does not end when they are fortunate enough to be granted settled status. Now, we have a situation where we have examples of our friends and neighbours applying for settled status, getting an acknowledgement and then being left in limbo for months. But, Presiding Officer, I have constituents of my own who have been granted settled status, and the news is conveyed to them by email. That is it. They are now worried that if they leave Scotland on holiday before the 31st of October, they may encounter difficulty gaining re-entry to the country. There is a genuine concern there. They're talking about printing off this email and carrying it with them and asking where they should carry it. So this is a very, very serious matter. We should all be alive to the stress that it's creating for our friends and neighbours. And with regard to the point she makes about Mr Macpherson raising this in the strongest personal terms, I will ensure that he's aware of the points that she's made.
Thank you. That concludes questions on government business and constitutional relations. We move on shortly to the next item of business. I'll wait for the front benches to take the places, please. Next item of business is a statement by Jean Freeman on the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People. The Cabinet Secretary to take questions at the end of her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call the Cabinet Secretary. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for this opportunity to update Parliament on the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department of Clinical Neurosciences. Before I do, I want to put on record my sincere thanks to all the staff for their forbearance in difficult circumstances. I am genuinely sorry that the considerable work they put into planning the move to the new hospital could not yet be realised. I am acutely aware that for many, the halt created significant personal challenges to important domestic arrangements. This morning, I met with the Chair of NHS Lothian and the Employee Director and have written again to all staff involved to update them on the current situation that I am now setting out to the Chamber. Let me also record my thanks to the patients and families for their forbearance and patience. The safest possible care for their children is my overriding priority, and I'm sorry that any impact the current situation has had on them. I will also today write to the Auditor-General. I have kept her fully informed to date, and I want to assure Parliament that we will, of course, fully cooperate with any further scrutiny Audit Scotland or the committees of this Parliament may choose to undertake. Presiding Officer, following my decision to halt the opening of the new facilities in July, I commissioned two reports, one from KPMG and the other from NHS National Services Scotland. KPMG were asked to consider issues of governance and establish the facts leading to the decision to delay the move. NSS were asked to examine the whole site to advise me on relevant compliance issues. I am publishing both reports today. The NSS report provides a detailed assessment of key buildings and identifies issues which require to be resolved to ensure safety prior to occupation. While the report is technical, I would highlight the following areas. In ventilation, and in addition to the issue previously identified in critical care, remedial action is required on the quality of work in a number of areas, with specific issues identified in haematology and oncology. On water systems, independent testing identified no widespread contamination of the water systems, but NSS has recommended some remedial and precautionary actions, as well as a system-wide disinfection prior to occupation. On drainage and plumbing, NSS has recommended active monitoring of the drainage system and concluded that elements of plumbing require monitoring and routine disinfection, but that this is considered a low risk. NHS Lothian have accepted all the recommendations and their action plan is also published today. Phase 2 of the NSS review is assessing fire, medical gases and electrical safety. And while that work is still in progress, there is no indication that findings in these areas will create a further delay beyond that which I will set out. It is clear that there is significant work to be undertaken to ensure the site is fully compliant. The work that has been done over the past few weeks to identify and plan the remediation of all the outstanding issues allows me now to give a clearer indication of a realistic timeline for moving to the new hospital. The additional work recommended by NSS can be undertaken in parallel to the work to resolve the ventilation issue in critical care. The key consideration in determining when the move to the new facilities can take place is the time to rectify the critical care ventilation system. This work includes designing, procuring and installing the solution for the critical care and then rigorously testing and validating it. This is work that I regret to say will take time. In the interest of patient safety, I will not authorise a move to the new site until this work has been completed, tested and found to be fully compliant. The work will be carried out as quickly as possible, but to ensure that it is done properly and to give maximum certainty to staff and patients, I have concluded that children's services will remain on their current site until next autumn. The Department of Clinical Neurosciences is unaffected by the issue in critical care. However, the additional work required to rectify the other issues at the Children's Hospital may impact on the DCN clinical pathway. I am, though, mindful of the challenges faced in the current DCN location and have asked that the work on the Children's Hospital is phased to allow DCN to migrate earlier. My current expectation is that the DCN will be able to move in spring next year. The KPMG report on governance sets out a clear picture of human error and confusion over interpretation of standards and guidance and missed opportunities to spot and rectify that error despite clear references to the requirement to adhere to relevant technical guidance. Members will read the report in full, but in short, the main problem stems from a key document, the Environmental Matrix, first produced by NHS Lothian in late 2012, which was inconsistent with the guidance, but was referred to throughout the project. I want to be clear that I hold the principle of accountability in and of our health boards to be vitally important. This is a publicly funded project of strategic importance, which has not been delivered by NHS Lothian in compliance with the standards and guidance. That is unacceptable. There are clear issues to be considered now about accountability within the board. They must be considered carefully and with due process, and I will advise Parliament of the outcome of that work in due course. NHS Lothian is currently at level 3 of our performance escalation framework. However, given the issues with the new hospital and the number and level of issues to be rectified, the Scottish Government Health and Social Care Management Board has escalated NHS Lothian to stage 4 for this project. This means that in relation to this project, we have assessed that there are significant risks to delivery, quality, financial performance and safety, and that senior level external support is required. A senior programme director will be appointed, reporting directly to Scottish Government. All of this, the delay, the additional work needed at the new hospital and the additional work needed to ensure the existing sites can continue to operate well, all of it comes at an additional cost. Given that NHS Lothian had taken possession of the site, the unity payment of £1.35 million per month requires to be made, even though the facilities are not yet open. But these payments were already budgeted for, and so, strictly speaking, this is not an additional cost. The additional costs arise from the work needed to replace the critical care ventilation system, undertake the other remedial work identified by NSS, and work in respect of the continued operation and improvement of the current sites. These costs will continue to be refined and I will keep Parliament updated, but I can advise members today that the current estimate of additional costs for these works is £16 million. This is a publicly funded project, as I have said, of strategic importance, which has not been delivered in compliance with the standards and guidance required for the safety of patients and staff. The delay we now face will be borne by NHS staff in Lothian, by patients and their families, and the additional cost will be borne by the health portfolio. Presiding Officer, there have been many major infrastructure projects delivered by NHS boards in Scotland on time, on budget and in compliance. However, we cannot have a repetition of the problems we see today. That's not right for the public purse and it's not good enough for patients or staff. In line with the programme for government, we will move swiftly to establish a new national body for reducing and effectively managing risks in the healthcare built environment. The new body will have oversight for the design, planning, construction and maintenance of major NHS infrastructure developments, not least in order to ensure effective infection prevention and control and compliance with standards and guidance. The NSS and KPMG reports are detailed, and I appreciate that members will not have had time to read them fully before this statement. So I've arranged to meet opposition party spokespeople tomorrow to answer any questions they have. I have also written to the convener of the Health and Sport Committee and am of course very happy to provide his committee with additional information or to attend to answer questions. As I set out earlier, my overriding priority, and I know that is shared across this chamber, is patient safety. The children and families who depend on these hospital services should receive them in the safest way possible. The current situation is not one anyone would choose, but it is one that we will resolve and deliver the safe migration of service to the new Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and Department of Clinical Neurosciences. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in the statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for those questions when we must move on to the next item of business. The usual mantra, try to keep your questions after the front bench questions short. I call Miles Briggs, to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance copy of her statement today. I have to say it takes a pretty cynical government to try to bury bad news by sneaking out two major reports at the very time Parliament are asked to hold ministers to account. Deputy Presiding Officer, today's statement begs more questions than it provides answers. The Cabinet Secretary today expects us to believe that human error and confusion and a failure of an environmental matrix means that no SNP ministers are responsible for 7 years of this delayed project. Reading between the lines of the statement today, it looks like the Cabinet Secretary now intends to hang NHS management out for this problem. The Cabinet Secretary has been in her job now for a year. Her predecessor held the position for 4 years, while all these delays and problems were happening. What responsibility will SNP ministers take from these reports today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say I find all of that deeply disappointing. Let me be really clear. I am sneaking nothing out. I said on the 4th of July, when I halted the move to the new hospital site, that patient safety was my priority. It is then, it remains now. I also said at that point, and in subsequent issues, that I would publish the reports as soon as they were available. I have done that. I have done that, and I have offered, please don't mutter at me from the sidelines, I have offered a meeting with party spokespeople tomorrow precisely because I appreciate these reports are technical and that members are only seeing them today and they need time to review them, and we will do that tomorrow, and there will be plenty of opportunities, I'm sure, for members to ask further questions. I do not expect you to believe anything, actually. The KPMG report is clear on what it says. So is the NSS report. I am acting on those reports. And you will know, I am sure, Mr Briggs, because you will have taken great effort to understand your brief, that responsibility for infrastructure build currently rests with boards. So it is the boards who are responsible for the build and the compliance. I have said clearly, PFG said it last week, that we now need to move to a situation where we hold in a closer way expertise and responsibility for compliance. So we are addressing these issues. If you would care to listen to what I'm saying, I think you will agree with me that the approach I took on the 4th of July, have taken ever since and will absolutely take from now on, is exactly the right one for patient safety, for our NHS staff and for the public purse.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. This project is a disaster. The statement throws up more questions than answers, Presiding Officer, so we now need to have a debate timetabled in government time. The KPMG report on governance highlights human error, confusion over the application of standards and guidance, and missed opportunities to rectify mistakes. But we still don't have a clear picture of where responsibility lies. Are we to believe that no one is responsible? I think not. So I asked the Cabinet Secretary, does she fully agree with the reports? Does she believe these investigations are adequate? We know from the reports there was regular and extensive dialogue between NHS Lothian and Scottish Government. Who from the Scottish Government sat on the project board and where are they now? The role of NHS Lothian has been referenced many times in the statement, but ultimately the buck stops with the Health Secretary and with this Government. So on a principle of accountability, we need a full-blown public inquiry. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree, yes or no?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, my straightforward answer to that is the one I've given before. No, I don't agree, because I do not see what difference a public inquiry would make to the work that we've already undertaken, and I do not believe when the focus should be on remedying this situation and moving patients and staff safely to the new site, why we would then distract them from all of that into a public inquiry when we have these reports, when I am here to be accountable for what boards are doing. I have said in my statement that there is more work to do with the board, because I firmly believe in the accountability of NHS boards, both in boards and to government and the wider public, that there is more work to do, and I will update Parliament on that. Ms Lennon says she has many questions. Well, I look forward to hearing some of them tomorrow at the meeting, when I am sure that she will be there, where we can begin to answer some of those questions when she's had the opportunity to fully read the report. But the focus has to be on two things. How do we ensure that that new site, that major facility of strategic importance, is safe and that patients and staff can move there safely? I am absolutely focused on that. How do we understand why this happened, not just what happened, but why it happened? I've taken account of that in my statement, and I've said I've updated Parliament. And then what do we do in terms of wider infrastructure projects across the NHS, some of which have been delivered most recently on time, on budget and in compliance?
Thank you. Can I remind members, if you want to ask a question, you must press the request to speak button. Call Angela Constance, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Our children and young people clearly deserve more than the senior managers of NHS Lothian have been delivering. With the escalation to level 4 announced by the Cabinet Secretary today, does she agree with me that the board's senior management should reflect on the current situation and work constructively with any programme manager put in place by the government to deliver the new hospital and to get the finger out and get performance back on track?
Cabinet Secretary.
So it's important to be clear that, and I thank the member for the question, it's important to be clear that the escalation to level 4 is for this project. The board is already at level 3 in terms of other matters around performance. And of course, Ms Constance is right that the board should be and is focused, with the additional support that we have given them, on their performance across a range of issues, and already is making progress in those areas. The point about the level 4 escalation is a recognition of the importance of this area of work and the need to provide an external project director who I am confident the board and senior management will work closely with in order to deliver what we need done. In terms of reflection, I know from speaking to the chair of the board this morning and in other conversations that the senior team in NHS Lothian are reflecting on how we have got to this situation. We will continue those discussions with them, and as I said in my statement, I will update Parliament on the outcome from that.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I asked you on the 27th of June whether you felt it was going to be safe to open the sick kids, you responded that you had had all the reassurances that you had tasked NHS Lothian to give you. So my question is simple. What scrutiny did you put in place and what lessons had you learnt from the failure of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital? And therefore, what reassurances did you actually receive that those lessons have been learned? Because this seems to stem back from the tender process.
Thank you. And can I just say to members, you mustn't use the second person. I've let it go by, but the term you is the second person, Ms Ballantyne, and I want people to remember to say the member or whatever, but not to use that. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'm glad, and I thank Ms Ballantyne for raising that question. When I gave you that answer on the 27th of June, it was precisely because I had had assurances from the NHS board in Lothian that all of the issues of compliance had been met and the lessons had been learned that had come at that point from the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. I was advised on the 2nd of July that the ventilation system in critical care was not compliant with national standards and guidance, and I acted on the 4th of July in that regard. So I gave you the answer based on the information that I had been given by NHS Lothian at that time.
George Adam, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Paramount to all of this was and remains patient safety. Could the Cabinet Secretary outline what steps are planned by the NHS Board for the existing sites to ensure that they are as effective and as safe as possible for all patients?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member for that answer. We asked NHS Lothian to produce for us an additional plan in terms of mitigation for the existing site, both at Sheens and the DCN site at the Western General, and to give us an estimate of the cost that's contained within the overall estimate. That includes an increase in the maintenance levels, an additional expenditure there, but it also includes looking at a modular unit and that's actively underway in terms of DCN. There may be other alternatives, one of which was raised with me this morning, that may be clinically more suitable, but that the DCN site is the most critical area, and I am very keen that with the clinicians' involvement, we identify what can be done to manage the safety of that site until we can move to the new site at the Royal Hospital. And in terms of Sheens, the other area that is being actively looked at is in terms of the location of outpatients, so that we can increase the footprint of A&E in the existing Sheens site.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Rhoda Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to that point, the Sheens site is in my constituency, and while her statement mentions the cost of remedial action to the new site, what is the total cost of keeping the old site open, which was not programmed, replacing equipment that was due to be provided in the new hospital, maintenance to a building well past its sell-by date, and indeed contracts cancelled that have had to be renewed? What's the cost at the old site to keep it open?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the cost of maintaining the existing sites, which includes an element of dual running, the total estimated cost I have there is between £6 and £7 million. That includes some of the factors that I've mentioned, the interim modular solution and equipment, including in neuroradiology, as well as additional investments in the current Sheens site and in the DCN. As the plan is developed and there is detail under all of those, I'm very happy to provide that to the member so that he can be assured that all the issues that need to be taken account in his view are being taken account of.
Rhoda Mackay, followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary expand on the role of the new national body being set up to ensure that all future NHS building projects are protected against problems with water, ventilation and drainage systems?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, as I mentioned, we will move swiftly to establish that national body. Its objective is to better manage and reduce the risks in terms of the healthcare built environment. Its final function will, of course, be informed by the independent review being undertaken on Queen Elizabeth. It will have oversight, though, for the design, planning, construction and maintenance of major NHS Scotland infrastructure developments. It will hold expertise in these areas, including in microbiology, and critically, it will have a clear understanding of the interrelationship between the built environment and effective prevention and control. It will also have a compliance function, and so the work is underway at this point to bring that body together, and again, I will make sure that Parliament is updated as we make progress in that regard.
Alison Johnson, followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary states that the additional cost of this shocking case will be borne by the health portfolio, so ultimately the people of Scotland. Those who support private finance claim that the risk is always borne by the private sector. So this is yet another case that reveals that to be false. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that her government's non-profit distributing model, just like PFI before it, means that it's the public that pick up the cost when things go wrong?
Cabinet Secretary.
There is nothing in either of the reports that I commissioned to suggest that the funding model holds any responsibility for the situation that we are facing and the need to halt the migration to the new site in the interest of patient safety. What I am keen to do, though, and why I said that the additional cost would be met by the health portfolio overall, is I am keen to ensure that frontline patient-facing services are not asked to bear any of this additional cost. And so within the overall health portfolio, we will manage that additional cost without an impact on patient services.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I restate my call for a full public inquiry into this matter? The KPMG report tells us that this disastrous outcome was baked into the hospital build from day one because of reference to a flawed environmental matrix in the tender document. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, what oversight did the government have over that tender? And if the most optimistic expectation that staff and patients will have to wait another year for the new kids to open, what is the worst case scenario for how long the delay will last?
Cabinet Secretary.
So let me deal with the timeline first of all. I have consciously ensured that the timeline that I have given Parliament today, that is autumn for the full children's services and spring for DCN, is such that people can rely on that timeline. If it's possible for us to see the work undertaken that is necessary quicker, then obviously services will move sooner than that. But those are the timelines that it is right and proper for me to confidently be able to give this Parliament. Mr Cole-Hamilton is absolutely right. KPMG report identifies a flaw in the environmental matrix document in 2012, which gave the wrong specification for critical care ventilation, but also points out that subsequent guidance and documents gave the right specification, and mistakes were made and opportunities were missed to spot those and correct matters. Mr Cole-Hamilton asked about government oversight. Government oversight in terms of the current relationship between NHS boards and these infrastructure projects is primarily around issues of finance and timelines. It is not in the area of these specifications, which is one of the reasons why we will establish that new national body, because that, in my view, gap and deficiency needs to be rectified, and government needs to have greater oversight in terms of design and compliance and the interrelationship between the build and effective prevention and control.
Emma Harper, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, I welcome the publication of these reports. Would the Cabinet Secretary join me in acknowledging the contribution of all staff who have continued to provide high-quality clinical services at both the Children's Hospital and the Department of Clinical Neuroscience in very difficult circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Harper for that. I absolutely will. I, with the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, visited both the Sheen site and DCN in the Western General in July and had that opportunity to speak to different groups of staff to explain my decision to halt the move, but also to hear what they believed was needed to be done. Part of that has informed the work that will go into additional investment into those additional sites to see them through the coming period. But I was struck most of all by staff's continued, undoubted disappointment. They were ready to move to a site that they had been anticipating for some time. They had made their own arrangements to accommodate that. Undoubtedly disappointed in those circumstances, but very, very impressed by how quickly they were moving to be able to continue professionally to deliver high quality care. I've written to them then, I wrote to them again today, and I intend to visit those sites again this month to talk through with staff what I have laid out in Parliament, what the reports say, and to answer any questions. I've also offered to meet the Partnership Forum of NHS Lothian, which, as members know, are the unions and representatives of staff from across that health board.
I have 3 further questioners. I want to get you all in, but you must make your questions short. Gordon Lyndhurst, followed by Sarah Boyack.
The Cabinet Secretary has confirmed in her statement that the payment of £1.35 million per month will continue and a further £16 million of additional costs incurred. Can she clarify the detail of these additional costs and whether any of them will be recovered for the public purse?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I said, the additional costs cover the cost of maintaining existing sites, which I outlined for Mr Johnson, project team costs and the costs of the work that needs to be done to remedy the new site. So the cost of upgrading the ventilation system in critical care, fixing the ventilation and other matters elsewhere on that site, which NSS report identifies. I'm again happy to provide the detail of that to the member if he would find that helpful. In terms of whether any of it is recoverable, it is something that KPMG report didn't express an opinion on the accountability of individuals or organisations. That will be something the board will wish to consider, given that it holds the various contracts. It will wish to consider that with its legal advisers, and we will continue to have discussions with them on that.
Sarah Boyack, followed by David Torrance.
Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm how many procedures and operations have been cancelled as a result of these most recent delays? And will the Cabinet Secretary release the programme of meetings she and her officials have had with NHS Lothian, the project team and Integrated Health Solutions Lothian, where this project and the delays which have gone on for years took place, so that parents and NHS staff can see for themselves the failing in governance which have plagued this vital and much needed set of hospital facilities?
It wasn't really a short question, but never mind. Ms. Cabinet Secretary.
It is important, before I answer that question, to note that the KPMG report confirms that NHS Lothian's governance processes were exactly as they should be. I'm very happy to issue a list as Ms Boyack requests. I'd be happy to do that if she would just send me a note specifically. I didn't write everything down there that she wants to look at. In terms of procedures, there was, I think from memory, just under 4,000 patients who had to be notified of a change in location for their appointments and procedures. NHS Lothian staff worked remarkably well to ensure that that happened, both by telephone and followed up in writing. My understanding is that no appointments were cancelled. There may have been some that had to be rearranged, but no appointments were cancelled. In addition, we put in place a helpline which remains in place. In this month, the number of calls have declined significantly, 7 in the most recent week, but that helpline will be assisted to quickly get to whether it was Sheen's or DCN and their appointment undertaken in that place.
David Torrance, very, very briefly.
The Cabinet Secretary was clear in the closing of her statement, and it is worthy of repeating. Will she confirm that while this is a situation no one would choose, this Government will resolve it, will deliver a safe migration of services, and this children's hospital will open?
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely do confirm that. Patient safety first and last is my priority.
Thank you very much, and I thank members. We got through all the questions, and we'll have a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
The next item of business is debate on motion 18778 in the name of Michael Russell on the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland. I would ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, please. And I call on Michael Russell to speak to you and move the motion. For 11 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure that every member of this Parliament will always listen attentively to what Scotland has to say. All of us as enthusiasms. All of us as legislators, as members, and some of us as ministers also hear and pay heed to national and international voices from the third sector, from unions, from business, from those who lobby in one. The last few years of Brexit division show that listening is important, but they also show that we must do better. If we're to row back from the current impasse and find a way forward as a nation, we must listen to new voices and in new ways. We must turn down the volume on what divides us and turn it up on ways of moving forward together. And to do so, we must not just listen, we must pay attention, focus and understand, and then we must act. And that is what the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland is about. It is a radical act of listening, an intervention in a political culture that can seem more concerned with making its own point, no matter the cost, than listening to the points of view of others. Now, nobody, Presiding Officer, could deny that I am a robust politician. I was schooled in a robust age of debate, and sometimes it shows. I'm as guilty as anyone in this chamber of misusing language. But the times we are in call for other voices to be heard and people to speak in other ways. Formal politics is not the only way to find solutions. Sometimes it may not even be the best way. The Assembly is therefore about doing things a different way, with a different tone and developing a different democratic language. International experience shows that such approaches can bring new perspectives and new solutions. But by definition, such initiatives are not about politicians. And therefore this debate today marks the moment at which Scotland's Citizens' Assembly becomes an independent entity, reaching out to make a new contribution to our country. The Citizens' Assembly of Scotland now has its remit, and Parliament is being invited to endorse it. It is our first national Citizens' Assembly sponsored by government, but wholly separate from it, and its remit goes to the heart of the question facing our country. The remit asks the Assembly to consider three things: what type of country we are seeking to build, how best we can overcome the challenges Scotland and the world face in the 21st century, including those arising from Brexit, and what further work should be carried out to give us the information we need to make informed choices about our future. These are broad questions, but deliberately so. The Assembly will listen, deliberate and come to conclusions. It's entirely free to facing Scotland and the world. Within the framework set out in the remit in terms of reference, it will set its own agenda, put in place its own work plan, and draw its own conclusions. Could that agenda take it to places that are uncomfortable for this government? Of course. And if I'm prepared to accept and acknowledge that, then I have to say constructively to those who still stand against this initiative, what are you worried about? If I'm open to the views of the Assembly, if I am open to the views of the Assembly, surely you should be too. Surely you are not afraid to listen?
Mike Rumbles.
Glad the Minister took the intervention and is not afraid to listen. One of the problems is that there is a great lack of trust about the government's motivation for this.
I'm seeking to address this today. I will say the Minister who finds this entertaining might trust me a little to find out how this is going to move forward. We should all, Presiding Officer, want to be challenged by the Assembly, as it will say things and do things that make each and every one of us think anew and reflect anew. Think anew and reflect anew. Of course.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. On this subject of trust and thinking anew, does the attributed to David Martin, one of the co-conveners of the Assembly, that it was, in his words, a mistake to introduce into Scotland the idea of a citizens' assembly as part of a package of measures seeking independence for the country?
Michael Russell.
I've heard David Martin's view on this. I think in retrospect, I can understand why people think that. There was no intention, I have to say, Presiding Officer, to do... Presiding Officer, I'm trying to make a point which can be believed or not believed. There was no intention to say that the Citizens' Assembly would be driving forward any other agenda than the one I've put forward. I understand David Martin's point of view, considerable experience and insight into the engaging and inspiring of communities, into how best to listen, how to amplify the voices of the less heard. And, Presiding Officer, it is over to them now. We have also published this week a Memorandum of Understanding between the Scottish Government and the conveners. This memorandum, I hope, will make real the promises we have made about the Assembly's independence. It provides for a Secretariat accountable to and taking their direction from the conveners, for a budget and for the Assembly to be able to receive directly and independently the advice, support and services it requires. It's essential that this Assembly is run to the highest standards of public administration, that it demonstrates the potential for deliberative democracy and fulfills the ambition of everyone involved to develop something inclusive, accessible and open-minded. I understand the need for reassurance. I'm happy to meet with any representative of any party that wants to discuss it further. I'd encourage them to meet the conveners and to discuss these matters. And recruitment for the members has already begun. People are out there knocking on doors, working to find a broadly representative cross-section of Scottish society to take part in something very special, which for 6 weekends between October and April next year, they will debate, share views and decide on recommendations which could shape the future of their country. Now, the first meeting will be held over the weekend of 26th and 27th of October. That's only days before the current date of prospective EU exit. Things will undoubtedly change before then and change again before the Assembly finally reports in May next year. There will, it is almost certain, be a general election in the UK. This government will continue to press for a referendum which would allow the United Kingdom to stay in the EU. We will request the Section 30 order will put this Parliament's ability to hold a referendum on the constitutional future of our country, which it has voted for, beyond challenge. Presiding Officer, that uncertain background doesn't imperil the Citizens' Assembly, it makes it even more essential. With public attention focused on the latest indignity to emerge from Westminster, the Assembly will take a calmer, longer-term perspective. And during a period when claims of competing camps are likely to increase, I really have to make progress, I'm sorry. I don't think I would be given too much extra time by the Presiding Officer. During a period where the claims of competing camps are likely to increase in their vehemence, the evidence-based and balanced approach of the Assembly will help provide us with facts, considered opinions and a framework for thinking. Wherever we end up in spring next year, wherever we are debating, none of us will, I hope, wish to turn away from an informed, representative and balanced contribution to our national debate. I began by saying, Presiding Officer, I wanted to know and to listen to what Scotland thinks. But I'll go further. We need to know what Scotland thinks. We need to know the type of country the people of Scotland want to build. We need to know what people think are the greatest challenges. And we need to know what information the people of Scotland want to have if we are to face up the responsibility of overcoming these challenges. The Brexit debate has demonstrated what discord can arise when big constitutional questions are posed in a way that does not include a whole country, in a way that distorts rather than informs, in a way that allows no one, whatever side of the debate they're on, to have confidence in the terms or the implications of the outcome. It has shown what happens when there is only heat in a debate, with no light to shine into our different thoughts, fears and hopes. All parties in this chamber have spoken of the need to improve dialogue, to step back, to consider all points of view more carefully. This Assembly provides us with the opportunity to relearn how. This Assembly will report as it sees fit to this Parliament, to the Government and to the people of Scotland. Its remit in terms of reference require its report to be laid before Parliament. It expects this Parliament to consider and scrutinise the report, and it requires the Scottish Government to set out within 3 months what it intends to do in respect of the Assembly's recommendations. The Assembly's report will not replace this Parliament's democratic function of deliberating and deciding. It's one part of Scotland's story, but I hope it will be a big and significant part. Presiding Officer, this Parliament was the beginning of a new sign, to follow on Seafield's famous remark about 1707 being the end of an old sang. But a song can have many voices, and the more they sing in harmony, the better they sound. This will be Scotland's first National Citizens' Assembly, but not its last. The Green Party are proposing a future Assembly on climate change. This government will be happy to endorse that, help to make it happen in this session of Parliament. I believe adding citizens' assemblies to our civic and democratic structures is a natural step for this open and more inclusive Parliament. I'm sure that the lessons of the first one will help that happen. When Henry McLeish presented the report of the Cross-Party Steering Group in 1998, he set out the key principles that should guide the design of this place. They included an ambition that the Parliament should embody and reflect the sharing of power between the peoples of Scotland. We've done a lot to live up to that ideal, but we can do more. 20 years ago, this Parliament met for the first time. 20 years on, let's resolve to continue to innovate in the service of those who put us here and to ensure that they are more and more at the heart of what we do. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move the amendment 18778.1 for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I seem to have upset Mike Russell. He is so upset that he frequently takes to social media to plead that I talk to him. I know it's difficult to believe that I could upset such a self-effacing, modest, self-deprecating gentleman who's a member of this chamber. But if I can say to Mike Russell this afternoon that we'd be happy to talk any time on most issues. Indeed, we talk a lot on many issues over many, many months. In fact, we worked together on the EU withdrawal bill and the continuity bill. We didn't just work together, we agreed with each other on that. We agreed that the Conservative government were taking powers that should rightly have been placed here from the very beginning. We talked about the people's vote. In fact, we eventually persuaded them to back the people's vote. So we will work together where we can agree. We also support the Citizens' Assembly as a method, as a means to reach agreement on the way ahead on challenging issues. For example, to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, people will need to be prepared to make more radical changes in their day-to-day lives. Such changes, though, must have the democratic foundation, and a Citizens' Assembly on the climate would help to provide exactly that. We need to understand the different perspectives people have and the different ways in which this process will affect their lives. So that transition to a carbon-neutral economy can be accomplished as quickly and as fairly and as legitimately as possible. And it can be done through those assemblies. That's the kind of measure that we think the Assembly would be ideally suited for. That's why we deeply, deeply regret that the first opportunity to utilise this tool was when the First Minister announced it earlier this year as part of a statement all about the next steps to achieve independence. That's what Mike Russell's upset about, that he complains that we won't take part, but we don't support independence. How could we take part in that kind of initiative? So can he really blame us when we listen to David Martin as Adam Tompkins has already highlighted. He said it was a mistake to wrap the two together. And he was right. It is deeply flawed. As a result, the process is flawed. Now, I'm an avid reader of the national newspaper. That journal, that record of all things Scottish. Moving on from their campaign earlier this summer about the harassment of Scottish strawberry producers who dared to put the Union flag on their strawberry punnets, they turned their attention to the Citizens' Assembly. I thought it was good to give space over to this issue. In fact, they gave space to Joanna Cherry. Remember, Joanna Cherry, she's very famous today outside the court, who speaks for the Party on Home Affairs in the House of Commons. She wrote this: "I have been inundated with queries about how a Citizens' Assembly might work and how it could help us achieve independence." And she went on, "I was delighted when the First Minister embraced my plan as part of the package of measures paving the way for independence referendum 2. The Citizens' Assembly process will lay the foundation for the referendum." And Joanna Cherry went further at the SNP conference. With some degree of excitement, she told delegates that the Citizens' Assembly would be a concrete way to achieve our goal, which is to create a consensus around Scotland and a bigger majority for yes. A bigger majority for yes. Adam Tompkins.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm grateful to Mr Rennie for taking the intervention. I wonder if Mr Rennie knows that earlier on this afternoon in this chamber, in Portfolio Questions, the Cabinet Secretary, Mike Russell, was invited from these benches to distance himself from the remarks of Joanna Cherry, and that was an invitation he declined to take up.
Willie Rennie.
I find that astonishing, difficult to believe.
Point of order, Michael Russell.
I think it would be important that the actual words I used were quoted in this, and I think the official report might want to produce them. On no occasion were they used, I refused to distance myself. I made my position very clear as the Minister responsible for this. I think that should have been quoted properly and not improperly.
Both points have been made, and the official report can be checked later on today, and appropriate steps taken by any member who so wishes to do. Willie Rennie.
Joanna Cherry seems to have created a certain degree of excitement, not just in the courts today, but in this chamber. And I think that's quite right, because I am incredibly grateful to Joanna Cherry, because she's given us such clarity, in fact, such honesty. But her exposé of the real purpose of the Assembly makes it impossible for us to take part in it. We now know it is a ruse. It's a scheme, it's a mechanism to help their campaign for independence. Now, I favour abolishing... The member says that it's our obsession about independence. This was their idea to have the Citizens' Assembly. It was their idea to wrap it up with independence. It was their Member of Parliament that put independence at the heart of it. So don't say that we're obsessed about independence. It's them that are obsessed about independence. Look, I favour abolishing the House of Lords, changing the unfair first-past-the-post voting system. Having a written constitution, wouldn't that have helped us today if we had that written constitution? Powerful regional and national assemblies and parliaments, a federal structure. But all of that is impossible to have a discussion in the assemblies with this half Machiavellian. It's not even Machiavellian. It's half Machiavellian. It's half clever. It's an SNP approach. It's a Joanna Cherry-inspired Citizens' Assembly. And that's why we can have absolutely nothing to do with it. And no one who wants to keep the United Kingdom together should have anything to do with it either. Once we have stopped Brexit, we need to change the UK. But the idea that this very moment in the national crisis, we need yet another discussion about independence, another discussion. For goodness sake, let's move on. Let's stop Brexit. Let's get this country on track. Let's reform this country. This Citizens' Assembly has got absolutely nothing to do with that.
Mr Rennie, could you move your amendment?
In all the excitement, I forgot to move the amendment. I moved the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call Adam Tompkins for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to turn my attention first to the Liberal Democrat amendment, which has just been so movingly moved by Mr Rennie. And we on these benches very strongly agree with every word of it, not quite with every word of his speech, but with, certainly with the sentiment behind it. It is a matter of deep regret, I think, that the idea of a Citizens' Assembly for Scotland was introduced into this Parliament and into Scottish politics as part of a package of measures designed by the First Minister to achieve independence for Scotland. And I think everybody can understand, even Mike Russell can understand, why that has made us all so deeply suspicious of this, just as we have our suspicions about the referendums bill, which is another part of the same package. And for all of these reasons, Deputy Presiding Officer, we will be voting for the Liberal Democrat amendment tonight. Now I want to turn my attention to the government motion itself. And the first thing that the government motion says is that the Parliament supports the use of deliberative democracy in Scotland. Well, I do support it. I do support the use of deliberative democracy in Scotland. And let me explain why, or try and explain why, briefly, Presiding Officer, if I can. My reason for being supportive of the idea of deliberative democracy in Scotland is because I don't think party politics gets everything right. I don't think that this Parliament has shown that it is able to get to the bottom of every social or economic problem that faces Scotland today. For all of its merits, for all of its virtues, this Parliament does not have all of the answers, even when we all come together to agree that an issue is of pressing national importance. Climate change might be one good example. And if we had started with the Citizens' Assembly on climate change and then moved to other matters, I think that would have been infinitely preferable to starting with the Constitution and with the SNP's obsession on independence. But another example, and an example I've given before, we all agree that Scotland faces a crisis when it comes to drugs deaths. There is cross-party agreement that this is an issue which blights our nation and which I think shames us all, actually, that we have not been able to come together as a Parliament to agree a way forward. It is an issue which, unfortunately, and I think this is actually, it's not just unfortunate, it's appalling, that it has become constitutionalised about where reserved powers lie with regard to safe consumption facilities. It's exactly the kind of issue that party politics is failing to address in Scotland, and that a Citizens' Assembly could and should, in my view, be established to address. And if we'd started there, if we'd started with climate change, if we'd started with drugs deaths, then perhaps we could have had much less suspicion around the idea of citizens' assemblies, and perhaps we could have had genuine all-party support for it. Happy to give way.
Stuart Stevenson.
I very much accept much of what the member has said about drug deaths, and I first was involved in difficulties in this area in the early 1960s. Would it be helpful, though, if across the UK, all of those who might be able to influence policy and practice on drug deaths were able to sit in one room together? Or does it need a citizens' assembly to summon such people and bypass the political system? I'm not quite clear what the member is saying.
Adam Tompkins.
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is yes, it would be helpful and it should happen, in my view. And I know what the consequences of that are. The next part of the government's motion, Presiding Officer, notes various matters, which, again, we're very happy to note. We note the appointment of the conveners, we note the principles and remit of the Citizens' Assembly, we note its terms of reference, and we note, likewise, that the Citizens' Assembly's report will be laid before Parliament. We have no objection to any of those elements of the motion. And then the final part of the motion says that the government will consider the recommendations that come forward from the Citizens' Assembly and that Parliament will decide on those recommendations. Again, fine. I think that broadly gets the balance right between the role of the Citizens' Assembly, the role of the government to consider recommendations, and the role of Parliament to decide. But we will listen to what the SNP have to say, not just from the front bench, but from back benches as well this afternoon, about this motion before deciding how to vote on it tonight. If this becomes, as we suspect it will, and as we suspect it is, a proxy for independence, or for full fiscal autonomy, or for Devo Max, or for any other constitutional scheme designed to undermine the integrity of the United Kingdom, then we will vote against the government motion tonight. There is one very significant omission from the government motion, and that is the question of cost. What is it costing to establish the Citizens' Assembly, to administer it, to run it? What are we paying members? What are we paying conveners? What are we paying the civil servants who will help to service it? In the press, it's been reported that the cost of a Citizens' Assembly will be some £500,000. I don't know if the Minister can shed any light on that. I'm happy to give away to him if he will.
Michael Russell.
I think a key issue in the Citizens' Assembly is transparency. And the Assembly will be committed to publishing its costs in full. Right? So at the appropriate moment, and that will be up to the Assembly when it does that, it will do so. And I don't think there'll be any doubt about that, and it will be for everybody to see.
Adam Tompkins.
Well, I'm grateful to the Minister for that, although he didn't actually shine any light on the question. He just said it would be transparent at some point in the future. Look, we've heard, it's been quoted before already this afternoon, what David Martin has said about the coupling of Citizens' Assembly in Scotland with the idea of independence. But it's not just David Martin who is of this view. Neil Mackay, I think the former editor of the Sunday Herald and an independent-supporting journalist, has said this, and I quote, "The idea was a simple, elegant addition to our democracy. But the SNP has now stomped all over it," he said, "politicised it and made it look falsely like a propaganda unit. The party's behaviour is completely counterproductive." And I quote that, Presiding Officer, not in anger but in sadness. I think this had the potential to be a really good idea. It had the potential to be a really useful addition to the parliamentary democracy that we have here in Scotland, and the SNP have ruined it. The SNP have ruined it because they have coupled it with independence, and that has made us all very suspicious of what their true motivations are here.
Alex Rowley, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening for Labour today, I would like to state our support for the principles of citizens' assemblies. I would also like to welcome the appointment of both David Martin and Kate Wimpress to the Citizens' Assembly for Scotland. I do have faith that they will be both independent and hard-working co-conveners. Too often these days, I find myself having to advocate for democracy and reiterating the point that while flawed, it is still a good thing. More democracy is certainly no bad thing, and the principles of a deliberative democracy and its use in Scotland should be welcomed. Citizens' assemblies are a proven and respected method when done properly. They can help get services working together and allow us as a country to further develop a culture of citizenship. One of the key benefits is that they can allow complex issues to be explored in depth by the people who are directly affected. All of this is surely a good thing. In addressing the amendment in the name of Willie Rennie, I understand the point and concerns he raises, and I recognise that the purpose of the Assembly has been muddied by at least one SNP MP who asserted this Assembly was to move us towards independence. So I would be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary, in his summing up, will clarify this point again. I know he's done so already, but if he can clarify that again. The way I understand it, the Government are committed to bringing the Assembly forward in good faith. And if this is indeed the case, we will participate in good faith in return. I have some experience. Yep.
Mike Crumbles.
It is about motivations. I mean, the First Minister said we face a climate emergency, and we made the point that this would have been an ideal vehicle for attacking that climate emergency. This is not an emergency, however you look at it.
Alex Rowley.
I'll certainly come on to that point. I have some experience in deliberative democracy. While I was leader of Fife Council, we held one of the first citizens' juries in the country. This was back in March 1997, and it was established to examine what public agencies and local communities could do to create employment opportunities in Leavenmouth. This was an incredibly positive experience, and at the end, the jury made over 50 recommendations, most of which, I'm pleased to say, were implemented. When speaking with the people that have taken part in these kind of juries or assemblies, one of the key messages that comes across is how positive the experience was. Here are some of the views that were given by participants in the recent Irish Citizens' Assembly. And I quote, "It helped me to listen, understand and develop empathy. It got balanced and truthful information out among the people of Ireland. It took the debate out of the realm of fearful self-interested calculation. All of this we could surely use in our politics in Scotland at the moment. I am told that one of the key messages to learn coming out of the Irish Assembly was how to engage with the press and get them on board at an early stage. It can be too easy for the press to see citizens' assemblies in a negative or sceptical light. So I believe it is key to the success of the Scottish Assembly for the press to be fully engaged in the process at all stages. That also brings about much greater transparency. I am pleased that it has been stated that the Citizens' Assembly for Scotland will be independent, transparent and inclusive. These objectives are good and I am sure will get widespread support throughout the country. We are willing to go into this with an open mind and I hope that the Government are willing to do the same. The questions proposed to frame the Citizens' Assembly of what kind of country are we seeking to build, how can we overcome the challenges Scotland faces, including Brexit, and how can people be given the detail they need to make informed choices about Scotland's future are surely welcome questions, and Scottish Labour is willing to engage in these discussions. Our country is undergoing a massive political upheaval, and we need to work together where we can to ensure a level of stability is returned to the whole of the United Kingdom. The questions framing the Assembly are questions I myself would like to answer. And I believe through collaborative working and engaged discussions with the public, we can set out the kind of Scotland we want to see flourish into the future. We are not a party that stands for the status quo. So we will engage in these discussions on what kind of country we want to live in and what best meets the needs and aspirations of the Scottish people. And I am clear, part of this will be constitutional, social and economic reform across the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is far too centralised as a state. Indeed, Scotland has become that way as well. And we would like to see reform of how our state operates at an economic, political and constitutional level. And we would hope the discussion takes us in that direction. I will finish, Presiding Officer, by saying to the Tories and the Liberals, we cannot stand still. We cannot go backwards. Support this initiative and let Scotland move forward.
I now call Patrick Harvey. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the motion that's been brought for debate today. I think the Greens have long-standing expressed support for deliberative democracy in a range of different forms. At a local level, with participatory budgeting, for example, we've seen that it can be done well or done badly, and we need to, as we explore the greater use of deliberative democracy, we need to learn from that experience. I don't think that learning is going to be well served by the kind of debate that so far we've seen this afternoon. Deliberative democracy, and Adam Tompkins is right about this, does not in any way need to be seen as in conflict with parliamentary democracy or undermining the role of elected governments or elected parliaments. It can be and should be complementary and enriching in a way that there was so chronically missing in the run-up to 2016. Adam Tompkins and I are both on the Finance and Constitution Committee, which has been hearing evidence on the referendums bill. And while we, I'm sure, won't agree on everything about that, one of the common themes that I think we can all recognise from the evidence that we've heard so far is a distinction between a referendum held in the full light of a well-worked-up, detailed proposition, either published legislation or something detailed like the Scottish Government's white paper, and on the other hand, what we saw in 2016, a referendum based on a narrow proposition, something as simplistic as a slogan, "Take back control." I think the Irish experience of using citizens' assemblies to inform and enrich the debate about constitutional change in their country is something that we should learn from, something that is a far greater expression of genuinely deep democracy than what we saw in 2016. And if the question on EU membership, for example, had been subject to that kind of detailed deliberation in advance, I think we would have ended up with a much richer debate and far greater clarity about what should happen as a result. Inevitably, further constitutional change is coming. Whether Brexit goes forward and is implemented, and I hope that it can still be stopped, or if it is killed off in its tracks, and we simply reflect on what has happened to us over these last 3 years, and the level of contempt that has been shown to Scotland's democracy by the UK government. Further constitutional change is clearly coming. Let's make sure that when it comes, it is as informed as it could be, as it could possibly be, by that deliberative process. Now, I understand that some people want to see this simply as an opportunity to have a proxy debate about independence. Adam Tompkins doesn't need to be suspicious that the SNP might privately, secretly, covertly support independence. We all know that they do. He knows that I support independence. I know that he doesn't. I have no fear from a citizens' assembly that wants to consider whatever proposals Adam Tompkins comes forward with, even if it was to support in every dot and comma the UK government's proposals for what should happen after Brexit. I would have no hesitation in seeing a citizens' assembly consider those options, and I wouldn't feel threatened by it. I give way.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm very grateful to Mr Harvey for giving way. I don't feel threatened, Mr Harvey, but the difference is this. In Ireland, Citizens' Assembly had all-party buy-in because Citizens' Assemblies started on issues where all parties agreed needed to be addressed by a Citizens' Assembly, and that is not the case in Scotland, and that's what I regret.
Well,
Patrick Harvey.
Indeed, I regret that Mr Tompkins' party isn't buying in. He's perfectly capable of buying in and seeing any issues that he thinks the Citizens' Assembly should consider, it will consider. Similarly, I will in just a moment, similarly with the Liberal Democrats, I don't think that a Citizens' Assembly should rule, for example, that federalism is to be rejected. But I don't think that the Liberal Democrats should be unwilling to see a Citizens' Assembly come forward and offer their proposals to it.
Mike Rumbles.
Harvey for giving way. Would he not agree with me that we can all agree, and have agreed in this chamber, that we face a climate emergency? I would have thought he, of all people, would have wanted to see the first subject that the Citizens' Assembly address is this climate emergency, yet we've heard nothing about it from him.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, Mr Rumbles does know, I'm sure, that that was the basis of our amendment, and I'll come on to that in a moment. I do want to say, though, that unlike him, I do think that the current constitutional crisis that we are in also constitutes an emergency. From the contempt that's been shown for devolution to today what has been deemed an illegal proroguing of Parliament, I do think that we're in a constitutional crisis which should be considered an emergency. I regret that the only amendment that we will be able to vote on today, therefore, is the Liberal Democrat one. The Green Amendment did learn from the experience in Ireland, which, for example, identified broad brushstroke ideas like the role of taxation in the transition to a low-carbon economy. Not answering the detailed questions, but addressing that broad brushstroke. I think that the climate change bill gives us the opportunity to use the same deliberative democracy approach in relation to climate change. I'm glad that the Minister has said he supports that. I hope that he will say on the record that he will back an amendment to the climate change bill to mandate that process. And although I'm not able to move that amendment today, Presiding Officer, I do propose it, and I propose it to all parties in this chamber, that they will back an amendment to the climate change bill as well, to ensure that we can move forward in that open, participative and deliberative process in relation to climate, just as we should and must in relation to the Constitution.
Now move to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. We're quite tight for time, so any interventions will have to be included within the 6 minutes. And I call Angela Constance to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The motion before us today is asking Parliament to endorse the point that deliberation should be at the heart of our decision-making. And I feel that now more than ever we need our politics to be the product of fair and rational debate. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that we strip out passion from our politics, as we always need to show that we care. But I think that in these troubled times, we very much need to bring back into vogue clear, calm heads and good old-fashioned common sense. And in that regard, I do believe citizens' assemblies have a contribution to make in helping to change some aspects of our political culture and discourse. I'm a big fan of the author Zadie Smith, and she counsels us that for progress to survive, it needs to be looked after and reimagined. And the events of the past few weeks show that we just can't take our democracy for granted. And while I have never, as a lifelong nationalist, wanted to be ruled from Westminster, I've always felt somewhat disengaged from it. I do nonetheless have every right as a citizen to be absolutely outraged that the so-called Mother of Parliaments is being prorogued, the longest suspension in recent history, and to hear ministers of Her Majesty's Government speculate on the TV about how they might find ways around legislation. And I'm sure that I'm not alone in that within this chamber across the political divide. And the reality is we are in a big national crisis across the UK. And the other reality is that at the end of the day, no one knows what will happen next, although we all like to speculate. So I do think it is important that here in Scotland, in our Parliament, that we meet to discuss how we strengthen our democracy. And while we shouldn't view citizens' assemblies in isolation, it's not a silver bullet. When you get to my age, you realise that nothing ever is. But it is potentially one part of a broader system of civic participation that could underpin a well-developed and functioning democracy. And whether at home or abroad, we see other factors that may challenge or may change our democracy as we know it. Globalisation, the rise of populism, the increase of corporate power, technological changes, social media as a news outlet and a campaign tool, the climate emergency, and poverty and inequality, a range of emergencies that won't necessarily be able to be tackled in isolation from each other, but all of which can lead to disengagement and distrust. So to protect our democracy, we need to constantly seek better ways to reach out and engage. And this is important because parliaments are really truly representative of the people they seek to serve. With the prominence of so many Tonians at Westminster, to me it increasingly looks and sounds like a period drama from the 1950s. But neither are we in this Parliament truly representative of the diversity of Scotland, and there are many folk from our different communities that are just simply missing. And this, of course, needs to be addressed, preferably within the 21st century, but it does underline the point that we need other forums out with the parliamentary bubble to inform our work and our decision-making. And the question being posed to the Citizens' Assembly is entirely open. What kind of country are we seeking to build, and how do we overcome the challenges we face? And we all need to be committed to really listen, think and then respond. And in that regard, I do think the Government has outlined in the motion its respect of this Parliament. And I think it is important not to miss the potential or the spirit of a citizens' assembly in that you can neither prejudice the outcome or pre-write your response to it. If you set up an independent assembly, you can't control it. And I think David Martin has certainly demonstrated his independence. We know that in a democracy, people are entitled to change their minds. They're also entitled to stick to their guns. The reality is that the question of Scotland's constitutional future has not evaporated. We can, of course, debate why that is and what we should or should not do about it. There'll be a range of views. But whatever your position of Scotland's constitutional future, surely we can all agree that whatever happens, we will need to find a path to travel on together on a range of issues. Presiding Officer, if I can end with one of Zadie Smith's clarion calls of calling on us all to stop worrying about your identity and concern yourself with the people that you care about, the ideas that matter to you and the beliefs you can run on. And I think we should all heed these words, and in the times that lie ahead, while we all have to be wary of making predictions, I think we're all going to have to step outside our boxes and our comfort zones. Thank you.
Rachel Hamilton, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Forgive my scepticism, Presiding Officer, but this Citizens' Assembly is no more than a Trojan horse. At first glance, it's a benign chance to let the public have a say, mired with a hidden agenda. Here we have it again. It's another chance for the SNP to push their independence plan. And this time, it's in the form of a Citizens' Assembly. We've heard today it is already been doomed to fail to represent the people of Scotland, and the SNP have fallen at the first hurdle in terms of their transparency and fairness. I see Mike Russell sitting there with his hand on his head because he is obviously in despair of what his SNP colleagues have said about this Citizens' Assembly. Oh, well, thank you very kindly. There are a number of reasons why I believe that this Citizens' Assembly is tainted by the SNP's agenda. First of all, Nicola Sturgeon announced the Assembly alongside cross-party constitutional discussions and Indy-Ref legislation back in April, and that was her part of her push to bring back another independence agenda. And this has been lambasted by former MEP David Martin as a mistake and criticised the decision by the First Minister to include this Citizens' Assembly with independence referendum legislation. That's point one. SNP, MSPs and MPs really let the cat out of the bag before the Assembly got off the ground. We've heard today that Joanne Cherry, MP, calling the newly announced Citizens' Assembly the perfect way towards independence. This commentary from the SNP has destroyed what could have been a simplistic, democratic and transparent process. We had Mike Russell saying Scotland has a fundamental choice to make about its future when it comes to citizens' assemblies. Well, we did, Mr Russell. We voted no in 2014 and your government lost their majority in 2016. I'll just make a little bit of progress, Mr Arthur. Moreover, a prominent academic, Dr Escobar, involved with the Assembly, has expressed his anger at Joanne Cherry. It seems there is a trend here. In response to Cherry's claims about the Assembly, Dr Oliver Escobar, who was involved in organising the Assembly, said he was kind of fuming at the statement, believing Cherry had made the forum's work 10 times harder. Maybe Miss Cherry had wished she had stayed quiet about this. That's point two. And on top of these bloopers, it's going to cost the taxpayer £500,000 to fund. Many will be rightly furious that the government is spending on this direction of travel as it has been experienced from the comments from the SNP politicians. I'll give way.
Bruce Crawford.
The member would tell us what role Joanna Cherry has in the Scottish Government.
Well, Rachel Hamilton.
Well, do you know that Joanna Cherry, I'm not sure if you know, but Joanna Cherry is a member of the SNP party. She has a role to play. Well, she has made her comments and she has put the scepticism into the public, and that has caused an issue with transparency and fairness regarding this, because we are not against the concept of citizens' assemblies. The questions up for debate are not set by this Citizens' Assembly itself. They are set by the SNP government. The First Minister set out 3 broad questions, as we've heard from Mike Russell. And forgive me for my suspicion, but these questions have nothing to do with fixing the government's domestic record and everything to do with the Constitution. It's nothing to do with, for example, reducing the deficit in Scotland. It has nothing to do with declining NHS performance or fewer teachers in our school. What I would like to see, and many of my colleagues would like to see a Citizens' Assembly do, is discuss how better we can reach a zero-carbon economy, how better we can deliver climate change, and the list goes on. To draw together these points, it may be argued, Presiding Officer, the real Citizens' Assembly is here in this Scottish Parliament. Across the chamber, there are many people of all political persuasions. from all walks of life, different backgrounds, from different professions and different life experiences. We are elected to represent our constituents. We stand up for them in this chamber every day. However, we should remain open-minded about the concept of citizens' assemblies. To conclude, people are highly suspicious about the motives of the SNP. They want a citizens' assembly because it has been and will always be about independence. Simply put, Presiding Officer, it is a talking shop for independence and very little else. How can that opinion be turned around? Will it seek the views of people on how the SNP have dismantled local frontline policing, leading to an increase in crime? No, thank you, Mr Arthur. Will it seek the views of people on how to reverse the SNP's failing on school standards? Will it seek the views of people on how rural areas are becoming increasingly more isolated in a technologically advancing world? It is a matter of deep regret that what potentially could have been a good idea has been tainted. Using assemblies has been effective in other countries. It just seems that the SNP's incurable narrowness of their constitutional agenda has destroyed what could have demonstrated a new way forward to reflect public opinion. Thank you.
Stuart Stevenson, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Interesting contributions from the Conservative benches. Adam Tompkins saying that we do not have all the answers here in this Parliament, and I agree with them. And Rachel Hamilton now saying that this Parliament is the Citizens' Assembly. Fundamentally different points of view. So there's obviously a difference of point of view in the Tory party. In the SNP, we have robust debates and ways of dealing with different points of view. But I think the thing I want to start with is the character and experience of the convener. I know one of them, I don't know the other. David Martin, when he was first elected as an MEP, in the 1980s, he came into the Bank of Scotland to meet some of the senior executives, and I remember sitting around the lunch table, because we were hospitable to David Martin, to hear the questions that he had and the responses he had to the issues that he was raising with us in the Bank of Scotland. So that's more than 30 years ago. So the one thing that David Martin brings to the table is objectivity. The second thing he brings to the table is experience. And the third thing that he brings to the table is a man who's honest in his political opinions. And they are not my political opinions. They are political opinions that come from a different tradition. So if we attack the Citizens' Assembly, we attack David Martin and his substantial record of public service and his preparedness to serve the public good and to serve the democratic deficit that there undoubtedly is, the democratic emergency that there is in these islands. Today's court judgment is just one part of a continuing failure of the democratic systems in the UK as a whole to solve major problems. Now, climate change. I absolutely support the proposal that's come from the Green benches and been supported from the Conservative benches that we need to involve citizens more in the issue of climate change. I took the bill forward in 2009, and we had unanimous support then. I hope again we will do so here. But we're in an era of post-truth politics. Climate change is an issue. Globalization is a matter of debate. Our citizens have to be part of deciding our future. Now, in this, who's actually taking the risk by establishing the Citizens' Assembly? We in this Parliament have a majority in favour of independence. But we, who support that particular objective, part of a wider agenda, not standing on its own, we are taking the risk that this Citizens' Assembly, independent of government, chaired by someone who's been a lifelong opponent of the political philosophy that I espouse, can come up with a conclusion which will make me desperately uncomfortable. Now, I happen to believe that we will have convincing evidence and arguments that will lead them to a different place. But we are the ones taking the risk, those of us who support Scottish independence. The fact that the Tories will not take such risks, the fact that the Liberal Democrats will not take such risks, is very revealing indeed. So, Presiding Officer, we have an opportunity to recalibrate the way our democracy works. The what is in front of the Citizens' Assembly lays out the way they can address issues, but they are masters of their own destiny. The Liberal Democrat amendment does not disagree with the remit in terms of the Assembly. I invite them to endorse them in their concluding remarks. And of course, the word independence appears nowhere in it. The UK's relationship with the devolved nations in general is changing, and indeed within England there are huge tensions across the geography and different experiences of people in different parts of England. So citizens' assemblies can be an important part of allowing countries to consider how they take themselves forward. In Ireland, the removal of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution was a suitable place for the Citizens' Assembly to contribute to the subsequent debate in the referendum. And very successful it was indeed. The referendum followed closely the recommendations of the Assembly. But more to the point, participants said that it made them consider the impacts of a proposal in ways they would never considered before. That's important, to rely on the deep reflections of fellow citizens who come without the baggage that every single one of us here as a party politician inevitably has. It brings honesty and openness to the deliberative process, and I congratulate our friends in Ireland showing us the way to reignite thoughtful dialogue. It's worth just briefly mentioning this issue of Brexit itself. If we had, in essence, 3 years ago, taken forward the post-2016 referendum deliberations via a Citizens' Assembly, I think we would have not got ourselves tied into the cul-de-sac that was laid down by the Prime Minister in January 2017, which has contributed to the failure of the political system to come to any meaningful conclusion. Presiding Officer, this is not really a debate about the government, the proposals from the government for an assembly. It's actually about the credibility of David Marsden, a man I've often disagreed with, but I continue to respect.
Claire Baker, followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This afternoon does give us an opportunity to consider the Citizens' Assembly in more detail. For the publication of our remit in August and the Memorandum for Understanding, which was published earlier this week, there has been limited opportunity for parliamentary scrutiny of the proposal, and this afternoon gives some opportunity to explore the issues involved in establishing a Citizens' Assembly. As others have said, when the First Minister announced plans for a Citizens' Assembly, Scottish Labour gave a cautious welcome to the news. It is regrettable that the Scottish Government did not bring the proposal at an earlier stage to Parliament. In Ireland, cross-party consensus was achieved through parliamentary scrutiny and the ability to consider and amend the remit. I have previously highlighted concerns regarding the nature of the announcement as part of wider plans to pursue a second independence referendum, which risks faith in the process. While the memorandum that was published this week emphasises the independence of the Assembly, it remains to be seen whether or not the Government's ambition for another referendum is the intended purpose of the Assembly, though I hear the Government's assurances on this afternoon. The inclusion in the remit of a specific role regarding the options for constitutional reform does little to dispel these concerns, and there is a job of work for the Assembly to consider how they will approach this discussion and what direction this will lead them. We are at the stage of handing over the process to the Citizens' Assembly, and it must be for them to set their own agenda. Deliberative democracy can be a valuable approach to questions which face a society and its future. It can be used to engage citizens in what is seemingly intractable problems, or questions that have the potential to cause division in communities. Involving the public more directly in the democratic process is something we should all support as parliamentarians. We have seen examples of citizens' assemblies in Poland, Canada, Ireland and Australia, providing opportunities for participatory democracy and addressing a range of issues, from reducing fossil fuel use to the reform of the abortion law. Providing a forum, a structure and time for members of the public to hear evidence, to challenge what is put before them and to question experts, these assemblies can also contribute to wider knowledge and understanding if engagement with the broader population is secured.
I attended the sessions involving representatives from Ireland, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for arranging that, where we heard about their experiences, and we can learn a lot from those countries that have already been through the process. In setting up our Assembly, we must provide an opportunity for Assembly members, as representatives of the wider population, to determine which areas they want to focus on. And while the remit that was published last month is broad, it is for the Assembly to decide where they wish to focus. So moving on to consider the progress of the work. While the recent publication of the remit is a welcome step towards the first meeting in late October, I note that the Citizens' Assembly website information still indicates some areas in which decisions are yet to be made. Among these are critical decisions on the best way to involve the wider public in the process and how exactly the Assembly will operate, including live streaming of content beyond deliberative sessions. Decisions also need to be taken on whether access will be provided for observers and the media. Key to all of this is a need to balance the public interest and transparency with the legitimate need for protection of the privacy of Assembly members. Recruitment of 100+ members is underway, but it is far from a straightforward task. And I understand that in Ireland, the percentage that agreed to take part was quite small, and it was quite an onerous task. There are also some issues with retention as the model in Ireland rolled out. Aside from balancing the membership in line with the broader population, those taking part need to be convinced of the argument that providing their time and participation over a number of weeks is a worthwhile task for them and the contribution that they can make to society. I have a number of other questions the Cabinet Secretary may wish to address. Can the Cabinet Secretary give advice on what assurances are being provided to members of the public that their privacy will be safeguarded if they take part in the Assembly? And has a decision been made about what information about participants will be made public? In Ireland, names and broad geographical locations of members were published following the Assembly. Can I ask, will streamed footage include the Assembly members? Some Assembly members will have social media accounts, and are steps being taken to ensure that they are not contacted or otherwise targeted via these and other routes that could influence contributions? We also need to think about potential for harassment or abuse if participants are identified, and the need to support them more generally through the period of meetings and beyond. So can I ask what measures are being put in place to support these members through the process in terms of pastoral care? As others have recognised, we do live in a time where heightened emotions are too often linked to political and social debate. We need to ensure that the Assembly is respectful and that we as a society respect the role that they are carrying out. We also need to consider how to ensure participants will be able to speak openly and freely within the Assembly, including views that they might not feel comfortable airing in an open forum. For example, will there be an option for them to submit their views through anonymously or through a proxy speaker? The fact that participants will be recompensed for giving up their weekends is welcome, and I should hopefully provide some incentive to those who might not consider involvement otherwise. There is a desire to include those who are not in employment, so can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the arrangements of this as a gift payment means that it will not affect people who are currently receiving benefits? As evidenced by the outcomes of the Citizens' Assembly, which has taken place around the world, there is much we can gain from this process. I look forward to the work of the Citizens' Assembly. We must recognise the timescales they are working to are very challenging, and as a lot have been asked of the people who have agreed to take part. The principles of transparency and access must be balanced with appropriate support and protection of privacy for members of the public who become involved. It has the potential to act as a stimulus for wider public engagement and discussion, and I hope it can help raise the level of debate to address the challenges we face as a country in the coming years.
Joan McAlpine, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you. I wanted to concentrate my remarks today on the impartial nature of the Citizens' Assembly, and in particular how the structures underpinning it are designed to deliver that impartiality. First and most importantly, the Assembly is independent of government, and it will set its own agenda within its remit. And leadership will set the tone here, and I hope we can all agree that the conveners are both impartial and respected people. That's critically important with regards to impartiality, because the conveners will also sign off the final membership profile. I'm fortunate in having had some contact with both the conveners in the course of my parliamentary work. Kate Wimpers has addressed the cross-party group on culture, which I convene in her role as Director of North Edinburgh Arts, a very successful community-focused project using creative people's skill sets to improve and deepen the engagement of local people in shaping the places where they live. And Kate brings that expertise to her role as Chair of Scotland's Regeneration Forum SURF, which again promotes innovation and engagement, and that strikes me as an excellent background for the convener of a Citizens' Assembly, designed to do the same thing in terms of political engagement. I've also been fortunate to engage with co-convener David Martin, who has given evidence to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, which I convene. And my earliest memory of David, who is Scotland's longest-serving MEP, was back in the 1990s, when the Herald newspaper gave a lot of space to his promotion of the Europe of the regions, then an idea very much in its infancy. And those of us who supported independence in Europe for Scotland at that time, I have to say we're not too enamoured of David's ideas at the time, believing that only a seat at the top table in Europe was good enough for Scotland. And I say that not to drag up the past, but to emphasise that David is his own man and has always been his own man, and is certainly not someone who could ever be accused of being told what to do by the SNP. David, as has been said, was Scottish Labour member of the European Parliament for 35 years, and he's the Parliament's, formerly the Parliament's longest-serving Vice President, and of course Professor of Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. We're very lucky to have both David and Kate in these roles, and I would hope that nobody in this Parliament would ever question their impartiality. In addition to these conveners, we have an impartial and arm's-length Secretariat appointed to the Assembly, and critically the Secretariat will be located outside Scottish Government offices and made up of civil servants who will adhere to the Civil Service Code and take their direction from and be accountable to the impartial conveners. The most important element of the Assembly is its members, and again the focus here is ensuring that they're completely independent. An independent contractor will identify participants and provide the Secretariat with a list of members. And I note that the Memorandum of Understanding says Scottish ministers will have no involvement with this element of the delivery of the contract. That Memorandum of Understanding also sets out clearly that the members are in the driving seat of this whole process. According to the remit of the Assembly, it will, quote, decide for itself which challenges it wants to consider, examine the current constitutional arrangements for dealing with those challenges and the options for constitutional reform, and set out what further work is required to provide the information that would allow the people of Scotland to make an informed choice about the future of the country. All these impartial people, the members, the conveners, the Secretariat, will be assisted in their work by expert groups. And Mary Lafoy, the chairperson of the Irish Citizen Assembly, referenced the role of these expert groups in her Michael Littleton Memorial Lecture delivered last year. And she said, I truly believe that their involvement, the expert group's involvement in the process and in helping myself and the Secretariat navigate through some of the most complex and challenging issues facing Irish society is one of the most noteworthy features of this process. That is the collaboration with academia, professionals and administrators. It's something which is of benefit to the whole work of the Assembly. But if the independence of the conveners, members, Secretariat, contractor and expert groups still doesn't satisfy, there's an additional layer of scrutiny to ensure impartiality, and that is the politicians' panel. And it means that the Assembly members, if they choose, can summon all the parties of this Parliament, even those opposing the motion today. I would therefore like to end by quoting a politician, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who wrote favourably about citizens' assemblies in The Guardian earlier this year. Mr Brown said they offer a fresh opportunity to invite more people into the decision-making process in a more structured and constructive way. So my message to those who oppose the motion today is to heed the words of Gordon Brown, abandon your cynicism and place your faith in the impeccable impartiality of the Assembly and its conveners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I call on Graham Simpson to be followed by David Torrance. Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And following on from Joe McAlpine's measured contribution, I have to confess that I am a cynic in general, actually, and I'm certainly cynical of government, all governments, because they all play the same games, and you have to, when you have an idea like setting up a citizens' assembly, you have to think, well, what are they up to? But you don't have to look very far in this case, because we know what they're up to. It's in the remit. It's all about Scotland's constitutional future. And listening to the debate, and I genuinely came into this with an open mind. No, I did, and I've heard things that I didn't realise, and I now tend to the view that citizens' assemblies can be a good thing, and that's involving people was something I always felt very strongly about when I was a councillor for 10 years, and seeing the way councils operated, that wasn't always the view of councils. They thought they knew best, as governments often think they know best. But I think it's a good thing if we ask people what they think. What I think is a shame is the way this has been done. And I think the contributions that we've heard so far that have said that we should have chosen different subjects to start this off would have been a much better idea. There are serious issues that a citizens' assembly should be looking at. Climate change is one. Adam Tompkins mentioned the drug crisis. They would be serious issues that a citizens' assembly could look at. One misconception, I think, around this is that this is a permanent body. It's not. It's only sitting for 6 meetings. It's only to look at the Constitution, and then it's presumably scrapped. It reports and it's scrapped, and then you set something else up if you want to do another citizens' assembly on another issue. Yes, certainly.
Not necessarily be the case. It could be certainly true that different membership was found. But if proposals come forward, and I indicated in my opening speech, there's already a proposal which the government has accepted in terms of climate change. There may be other proposals. So, for example, there are difficult social issues that may require this type of approach. So it's not necessarily the case, but I see the members' enthusiasm for Citizens' Assembly beginning to get going. So I would welcome his contribution on ideas for one.
Graham Simpson.
Well, Mr. Russell knows I'm a measured man. He can come and speak to me any time he likes. I am concerned, however, that there appears to be no budget for this particular Citizens' Assembly. We've heard it could cost up to £500,000. Mr. Russell, when he stood up, couldn't confirm that, couldn't tell us what the figure was. I think that is a matter of concern. That should come through the Parliament at some point. It should be budgeted for. The members of the Assembly are being chosen at the moment. We've heard about the co-conveners. I'm afraid I don't know either of them, so I've really got no views on either of them, but I'm sure they'll do their very best. In a breezy blog signed Kate and David, however, they said, "We've been busy getting to know each other and getting up to speed with the range of work required to deliver the Assembly. There can be few roles more worthwhile than helping our citizens seek common ground." Couldn't really disagree with that. But I think if we look at the remit of this particular Assembly, and this remit is set by government. Mr. Russell touched on the 3 questions that the Assembly will look at, and Brexit is mentioned, education isn't mentioned, health isn't mentioned, drugs isn't mentioned. It said it's there to consider, examine the current constitutional arrangements for dealing with those challenges and the options for constitutional reform. And within this remit, the Assembly will decide its own agenda. But that remit is set by government. So outside of that, it can do nothing. So it is, and it does appear to be a bit of a stunt at the moment for independence. So while I'm not against the idea of a citizens' assembly, I do regret the way this has been set up. Willie Rennie asked a question in a previous session. What would happen if this particular Assembly came out against independence, what would Mike Russell and the government do? What would their response be to that? We haven't had an answer to that. Perhaps when the Cabinet Secretary sums up, well, it's up to the presiding officer.
Yes. It was in the opening speech. All the recommendations of the Assembly will come to this Parliament. The Parliament will vote on them. If the Parliament were to accept those recommendations, the Government would bring forward recommendations it's bound to do so. It would do that no matter the recommendations. It is entirely clear.
Graeme Simpson.
No, I haven't, because I'm not quite sure I buy that. I think if the Citizens' Assembly came out against independence, it would be roundly rejected, and we may not have another one. My time is up, presiding officer. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I call on David Torrance before we move to winding up speeches.
Thank you, presiding officer. This week, the UK Parliament has been shut down by a Tory government at a critical time. Their actions have today been declared illegal. Even before they did that, we are at the height of the greatest constitutional crisis faced by the United Kingdom since the Irish independence 100 years ago. The move was both reckless and sinister. The shutdown of democracy was sought by a Prime Minister who is a leader of a party which does not command a majority in the House of Commons and who was installed as Prime Minister without any democratic mandate. Meanwhile, in Scotland, we are busy finding ways of improving our democracy and welcome the first meeting of the new Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, which will be held next month. Key features of the Assembly are independence from government, transparency, inclusion, access, balance, cumulative learning and open-mindedness. To me, all of these principles are admirable, but I would like to dwell on the final one, open-mindedness. The Assembly is a forum for open-minded deliberation between participants, ensuring that the public sees it as a genuine process of inquiry and to help ensure that it receives an open-minded response from this Parliament and the Scottish Government. That statement is taken from the Assembly's own mission statement. It emphasises the Assembly's separate identity and its independence from Parliament and Government. A Citizens' Assembly is not a new concept. Citizens' Assemblies have been set up in many other countries, Ireland close to home and British Columbia on the other side of the world, to name but two. It means we are looking for best practice in other parts of the world and then importing and adopting it to use in our own political system. We are outward looking. Transparency is another key feature of this Assembly, but what will this mean in practice? Will it be applied to all levels of the Assembly? It has been applied to a selection of Assembly members. 100 members from all across Scotland have been randomly selected to representative of the adult population in terms of their age, gender, educational qualifications, ethnic group, geography and political attitudes. Transparency will apply to its proceedings and will be live streamed so that we can all observe for ourselves if you wish. No, thank you. Transparency will be an important element in demonstrating the Assembly's independence from the Parliament and from the Scottish Government. It is vital to the Assembly's credibility for independence to be clear for all to see, and I strongly believe that the critics and cynics will be excited at the prospect of finding reasons to dismiss the Assembly's workings and outcomes. No, thank you. Something new and progressive, which is transparent and independent, will not be popular in some quarters. I was delighted to see former... No, thank you. I was delighted to see former MEP David Martin appointed as one of the Assembly conveners. I hope his knowledge of political institutions in the UK and at the EU level and other EU member states will turn out to be a huge asset to the workings of the Assembly. The appointment of someone from outside politics, Kate Wimpress, as other convener, will, I hope, create a balance of approach, of expertise and experience between the Assembly's two conveners. The Assembly's independence is enshrined in its own memorandum of understanding with the Scottish Government, so its conveners and members will be confident of their freedom to follow their own path within the Assembly's terms of remit. Needless to say, our exercise in widening democracy has not been welcomed by all in these chambers. That brings me back to recent events at UK Parliament. One reason the UK is in such a current mess is the choice of one particular party to pursue its own party interests over Brexit, when the interest is directly opposite to national interests. Had that party chosen an inclusive approach to all Brexit issues, putting the national interest first, our current political landscape would be totally different. In conclusion, presiding officer, inclusion is one of the key features of our new Assembly. All the political parties represented in this Parliament will be supporters amongst the members of the Assembly. So with that in mind, I would urge everyone in the Chamber to be forward-thinking and embrace opportunities offered by a Citizens' Assembly.
Thank you very much. We move now to winding up speeches. I call Willie Rennie to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The idea was simple. Elegant addition to our democracy. But the SNP has now stomped all over it, politicised it, and make it look falsely like a propaganda unit. Not my words, not my words, the words of Neil Mackay, independent supporter, and exactly the words that Adam Tompkins used, and quite rightly used, because this man is an avid supporter of citizens' assemblies. He sees the greater good that can come from the Citizens' Assembly, and he is embarrassed, in fact, ashamed that the party that he has supported, that has advanced independence, could treat this precious instrument in such a manner. And I think that is the fundamental problem that we have with the approach of the SNP government. I think it's also unfortunate today that there's been a personalisation of the debate. Both Mike Russell and Bruce Crawford sought to undermine Joanna Cherry and her role in this debate. I feel the need to stand up for Joanna Cherry. If they won't stand up for her, I think it's upon us to stand up, because she brought honesty, she brought integrity to this debate by revealing the true purpose of the Citizens' Assembly, which was to advance the debate. And they're shouting again. I will stand up for Joanna Cherry. She's done a great service to this country, and I think we owe her a debt of gratitude. But I think it's also ridiculous to suggest that those who criticise the way that the SNP has gone about the Citizens' Assembly is somehow undermining David Martin. That is an atrocious way to approach this debate. And in fact, it shows how weak the case is that the SNP has developed, that they have sought to claim that somehow I personally am attacking David Martin personally. That is not the case. No, not just now. The gentleman who's trying to make an intervention was particularly unpleasant in his approach to this debate this afternoon by claiming that I was attacking David Martin. In no way whatsoever were any of us seeking to do that. And that is the unfortunate bit of this debate, because their argument is so weak. Because their argument is so weak, they have sought to personalise it. And I think we should have nothing to do with that approach. Alex Rowley has agreed that Joanna Cherry has muddied the water, as he put it. But then he seems to have ignored the evidence that she has provided, which is that the SNP are seeking to use this just to advance the independence debate. And I hope he comes to see that that is the case, because we have heard on numerous occasions that the SNP try this trick every single time. What's wrong with a debate? What's wrong with having another discussion, a national conversation, say right across the country? We can have the taxpayer paying for SNP ministers to book halls out in every part of the country, so we can have another debate about independence. That was their first attempt at trying to engineer this debate, right back when they gained power in 2007. And we've had endless debates ever since. Ever since. We had the 3-year-long independence debate, which they lost. We had the white paper. We had a debate about the legislation for the referendum. We've had Andrew Wilson's report into the economic impact on the future Scotland and independence. We are encouraged to participate in all of these debates. It's endless. And you can therefore forgive us for being a wee bit bored, for wanting to move on, to try talk about something else, perhaps the Brexit crisis, for instance. Maybe we could try and deal with that problem. No, I'm not going to take an intervention. So therefore, I think it's deeply regrettable that the principle, the deeply held principle by many that Citizens' Assembly can do great things, is being undermined today, because it can do great things. If you look at some of the proposals that have come forward today alone, there's been the talk about having a Citizens' Assembly on drug deaths. I think that would be particularly valid to have that debate. I think we could bring together people from all parts of society to have that discussion. The one I proposed earlier on round about climate change, trying to get people to understand the need for personal behavioural change in order to meet our challenges on the climate. Perhaps on closing the attainment gap. That might be a useful thing to have a discussion about, how we can involve parents and pupils, people right across society so we can close that attainment gap. The SNP government have failed so far, so maybe it's time for somebody else to try and come up with some ideas. And of course, the social care challenge. Massive challenges on social care. Let's get people involved in that discussion. All of those things would come way before yet another boring discussion about independence, because that's all that the SNP seem to be interested in. No, I'm in my final few seconds. The Citizens' Assembly was announced by the First Minister as part of a package of measures to achieve independence. That is without doubt. The Assembly, the cross-party talks and the unstoppable legislation on another referendum. Mike Russell even managed to keep a straight face when it would be free from vested interests, even though it only exists as part of the independence package. The Minister set up the Assembly, recruited the conveners, allowed them to make speeches on the Assembly, designed the remit, and then said it was up to the Assembly to decide for itself what it wanted to do. No, it's not. The First Minister has never said full steam ahead for independence, subject to the conclusions of the Citizens' Assembly. Never said that. Those words never passed their lips. Because the truth is, the SNP are using this as another wheeze to try and get independence, but we will not be fooled.
Thank you. And I call Alex Rowley to be followed by Donald Cameron. Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has been interesting, but in many ways disappointing, but reflects perhaps where we are in Scotland, because anybody that's been living in Scotland these last 5 years could not deny that the question of the Constitution overarches all areas policy within Scotland, and we do need to find a way forward, and we do need to be asking questions about the best way forward. And what I would say is Labour is clear that we are taking the government at face value. We are engaging in this process. We will engage in the discussions on the way forward. But this Citizens' Assembly is the first national assembly to have been created across the United Kingdom. The first one to be properly resourced and organised in such a way to be effective. And I believe the eyes internationally, people will be looking at this assembly. So the idea is, as Graham Simpson put it, that it's a bit of a stunt for independence. Well, if that turns out to be the case, then I believe that will be exposed. But I do believe that the principle that's set out here is right. And yes, we, in future, if we get this right, can use such a mechanism to look at some of the difficult issues, not just drugs death in Scotland, but drugs policy, which seems to me to be far outdated, failing and continuing to fail. So there are other issues, but I do think we need to look at the way we move forward and be positive. The concerns by Willie Rennie and the Professor Tompkins around independence, I would have to say to you that the greatest threat to the future of the United Kingdom does not lie in the Scottish Citizens' Assembly. The greatest threat right now to the future of the United Kingdom lies with the Conservative and Brexit Party and Boris Johnson. That's a fact. Even his brother, Joe Johnson, resigned for his government, saying that he had to choose between family loyalty and what's best and what's right for the country. So, you know, the idea that a Citizens' Assembly can threat over that threat. So if you really are interested in the future of the United Kingdom, then you really need to start to stand up to Boris Johnson and tell him that he's not on, that he's damaging the United Kingdom. Yet,
Mike Grumbles.
Sorry, I was... Yeah.
Mike Grumbles.
The member seems to have bought the SNP government's motivation for this. But he doesn't seem to accept that it even could be possibly independence. I'm just thinking, you know, if he's bought that, I've got a bridge to sell him.
Alex Rowley.
The point that Stuart Stevenson made, I think, was a good point, where he talked about having taken the risk and the confidence that he had in his arguments. I'm very confident in the arguments, if you want to argue about the future of Scotland. I'm very confident that the economic case for independence just does not stack up in any shape or form. I'm confident that we can take forward the arguments and win those arguments, just as Stuart's confident in the arguments that he has. But I would say this to you, don't confuse that with arguing for the status quo, because right now Scotland, every region and nation of the United Kingdom is being let down by Westminster, by the Tory and Brexit Party, who have become obsessed with Brexit. I'm confident in my arguments. If you were confident in yours, perhaps you would come to this Assembly and work with the other parties to find the best way forward for Scotland. Remain in reform in Europe, remain in reform in the United Kingdom has to be the way forward. Yeah.
Stuart Stevenson.
Does the member remember that in 2011 the Liberal Democrats caused us to have a referendum on proportional elections? Only 10 out of 440 areas voted in favour. But Vince Cable, in July this year, says we should have a citizens' assembly. The issue is not closed by that referendum. Why should any other be closed?
Alex Rowley.
Well, I also remember that in 2010, Willie Rennie's Liberal Democrats did a deal with the Tories, and as a result of that, what did we get? Welfare reform that has created widespread poverty across Scotland and the United Kingdom. If you want to ask why people went out and voted for Brexit, look at the levels of poverty that was created by a Liberal Tory government in Westminster. The bedroom tax, a tax on never seen before. So I really think that Willie might be trying to appeal to a certain group of people in Scotland, but the reality is your party and the Tories have created the situation that we find ourselves in and the levels of poverty that are unacceptable. A number of people have mentioned about the co-conveners. I don't know Kate Wimpress, but she certainly has an impressive CV, and David Martin I know very well. I know David Martin's offered to meet with all parties to have a discussion around these issues, at least in the spirit of trying to find the best way forward for Scotland. I would urge you to meet with the co-conveners and share your concerns with them and hear what they have to say. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. I call Donald Cameron to be followed by the Cabinet Secretary. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate. When the Cabinet Secretary announced the creation of the Citizens' Assembly back in June, my colleague Adam Tompkins said that there is a role for citizens' assemblies, particularly when it comes to aspects of public policy that a parliamentary democracy has failed or is struggling to address and resolve. And the Cabinet Secretary himself said that democracy does not stand still, and we have to keep innovating in order to keep moving. But I couldn't agree more with both of those points. They're valid and substantial. And I concur with many of the sentiments made by others across the chamber who have spoken about examples of citizens' assemblies elsewhere, most notably in Ireland, which have been real drivers behind significant social change. The Scottish Conservatives are by no means against both the premise and the principle behind such institutions being created, and the role they may have in using a unique model of public discourse to drive reform. We fully support local democracy and devolving power from this place to more local democratic bodies. And I'm sure that both David Martin and Kate Wimpress, the co-conveners, I don't know them personally, but they seem to enjoy respect across the political spectrum, will work diligently alongside a committed group of representatives from across Scottish society. It's not the principle we object to, but the process, because it has been abundantly clear from the outset that the manner in which the government has proceeded has been short-sighted, to say the least. Despite warm words from the Cabinet Secretary, there is a justified suspicion that the Assembly's creation has been fundamentally designed to do one thing, which is to further the independence agenda. And when Joanna Cherry calls it the perfect way to advance independence, then it was always going to be a tough sell to the Scottish public as a fair and balanced forum to lead a conversation about Scotland's future. And earlier in the year, when he announced the creation of the Assembly, the Cabinet Secretary preached consensus amongst political parties when it came to such assemblies. But he also mentioned Brexit 9 times and independence twice in that statement, as well as being critical of the UK government. There was a hint of it again today. And the Assembly was announced alongside the referendum legislation and the cross-party talks. And therein lies the problem, because even at its birth, this has proved to be a partisan endeavour. And David Martin was right. He called this a mistake. Throwing the three things together created suspicion. Suspicion was his word. No one minds the rough and tumble of party politics in this place. Of course not. But it was really unwise, in my view, in our view, to launch this project in such a context. You cannot preach consensus on the one hand and at the same time push a deeply divisive policy on the other. Can I move on to discuss the remit of the Assembly, which the government has published? My own disappointment centres not on what is included, but what is omitted. There's no mention of how we should improve Scotland's schools, no mention of how we should reform our NHS for the long term, no mention of how we invest in infrastructure. Other MSPs have raised a number of different issues that could have been addressed by the Citizens' Assembly. Willie Rennie raised the climate emergency, but what about economic regeneration? We know, for example, that the UK economy is expected to grow faster than the Scottish economy over the next 4 years. It would have been intriguing to hear views about that. What about the total number of teachers falling in our classrooms? Serious day-to-day issues crying out for new and innovative solutions which the Citizens' Assembly could have addressed. And how much more invigorating would it have been if the Scottish Government had tasked the Assembly to focus on bread and butter everyday issues and not the Constitution. Deliberative democracy is suited to these kind of matters rather than polarising constitutional issues. And as others have pointed out, I think it was Graham Simpson who said that given it will only meet over 6 weekends and no more, it does beg the question of what could realistically, what it could realistically offer this Parliament in terms of a vision for the future. Yes, of course.
Arthur. I'm very grateful for the member giving way, and I would just note that the first aspect of the remit is what kind of country are we seeking to build, which is very broad. Could the member suggest how that particular remit precludes a discussion of any of the domestic or bread and butter issues that he referred to?
Donald Cameron.
Except it's broad. I think the remit has a narrow focus. And there are many people, both in and more importantly outside this chamber, who do need convincing that it will be more than just a talking shop for constitutional change. So, Presiding Officer, in summing up, I want to turn to a few of the remarks that colleagues across this chamber have made during this debate. Adam Tompkins and Graham Simpson were right to say that we should have started off with perhaps different topics. I want to concentrate on something that Angela Constant said, because she was right, in my view, to say that this Parliament is lacking in diversity and that there are voices in Scotland which we do not hear and which need to be heard. And I hope if the Citizens' Assembly achieves one thing, that it reaches those people, and I fully accept what she said. To conclude, our view, Presiding Officer, is that this can be a worthwhile exercise, but we remain concerned that it has been tainted from the beginning. I hope I am proved wrong. I hope this Assembly does eventually tackle some of the day-to-day issues that I've spoken about. We can all agree that it's time to remove some of the poison, some of the vitriol that infects our politics. A Citizens' Assembly would have been the ideal way to do this. But when a senior SNP figure calls such a body the perfect way to advance the independence agenda, then how can we approach this consensually? And more importantly, how can it have a transformational impact on public policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary, to conclude our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I come to the substance of this debate, could I just correct a misapprehension that appears to have arisen? A number of members have referenced Ireland and have referenced the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, but the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, which dealt with, amongst other issues, the abortion issue that did deal with other issues, was the second deliberative democracy innovation in Ireland. The first one, the Constitutional Convention, took for a number of years to set up. It was in the end passed by the Dáil without dissent. but it took a long time to get to that position. So the argument that says there was some outpouring of agreement at the very beginning simply isn't true. Nor is the fact that the first of those bodies looked solely at social issues. In fact, if you look up the remit of the first Constitutional Convention, that is, the Citizens' Assembly, you discover number 1 was reducing the presidential term of office. Number 2 was reducing the voting age. Number 3 was the review of the Doyle electoral system. Number 4 was giving residents outside the state the right to vote. So the first step in Ireland in these matters were constitutional issues which were not able to be resolved by the Doyle itself. So I think far from departing from what we are told is the Irish model, we're actually being remarkably consistent with the Irish model. And I think that should be borne in mind, particularly when we consider future assemblies. Because I take at face value the members who've said that they want to have future assemblies. Only one party has come up with a proposal for a future assembly, and I'll come to that in a moment. But if there are to be future assemblies, we might learn from that model too, though we need to move on. And the abortion one was also a constitutional issue, because it was addressing the constitutional ban on abortion. So I think members who talk about social policy, who talk about using this in a certain way, need to focus on that model, which I'll come to Claire Baker's point in a moment. We brought over from Ireland people with experience of this to have that conversation. Some of those who've been most critical did not take part in those discussions. But look at the actual history. Don't make it up. Now, there's two positions you could take on this afternoon's debate, Presiding Officer. One would be that, frankly, it is a pessimistic view. You would come away deeply depressed at how closed some minds are and how deep the divisions are, which are impervious to argument or reason. But you could come away with a more optimistic view, which says, in actual fact, what this debate has proved is that we need not just a Citizens' Assembly, but this Citizens' Assembly as more than ever. Because we need to find a way to debate these major issues without the type of rhetoric and division that we have heard this afternoon. Let me go back to the issues within the remit, because these are the issues that we're trying to look at. What kind of country are we seeking? How best we can overcome the challenges that Scotland and the world face in the 21st century, including those arising from Brexit, and what further work should be carried out to give us the information we need to make the informed choices. It seems to me that if you were to perhaps just step back and read the official report of this tomorrow or the next day, you might come to the conclusion that the Citizens' Assembly is precisely the means by which the divided membership of this chamber can be brought together. So I'm on the side of optimism. We need to... Yes, of course.
Graham Simpson.
Secretary, for taking the intervention. The problem with all that is if you actually look at what the remit in terms of reference says, it says Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, Scotland's constitutional future. It's not dealing with wider issues like education, health, anything else. It's about the Constitution.
Cabinet Secretary.
Simpson, I'm happy to do so again, and I would suggest, because I know he's a man of open mind and clearly he was edging towards support for the Citizens' Assembly, he should go and talk to the co-conveners. He should talk to the people who are involved in this, and he will see that they are going to interpret this, I understand, in a very wide way indeed, and have the opportunity to do so. And indeed, the remit in development and discussion with the conveners, because it has been developed and discussed with the conveners, gives exactly that flexibility. So we have an opportunity here to move forward with something new and innovative. And I think the debate tells us that there are not entirely closed minds like Mr. Simpson's, which is at least partially open to persuasion. And I have to say that, I think we need to be able to persuade people that there is such an opportunity. And I want to persuade people that there is such an opportunity. And Alec Rowley asked me to address some key issues in so doing. And I want to do so, Presiding Officer. The Citizens' Assembly will be independent. I have gone through in great detail why that is so, but I confirm it yet again here. It has a published and clear remit, which it is perfectly possible, indeed desirable, for those who are running the Assembly to interpret. It will be fully transparent. I want to come on to some of the issues that Claire Baker raised in a minute. It sets its own work plan and agenda. There is a commitment for it to report to the people of Scotland, to this Parliament, to the Government, and for those recommendations to be taken forward. And it is established as an act of good faith. And I am grateful for the position that Mr Rowley has taken in this, because I want him, at the conclusion of this, to be able to say that the good faith that we showed was good faith. Mr Rowley and I have worked opposite each other for many years. I don't think we've ever deliberately told each other a falsehood. I want to make sure that that is provable and proved by the actions of the Assembly. But it is up to the Assembly to do so. And if I can prove that to Mr Rowley and his party, I hope in time I might prove it to the Conservative benches, some more than others, I have to say. But there was a willingness, I heard from the Conservative benches, to be persuaded that the Citizens' Assembly was a good thing, and perhaps that this Citizens' Assembly might surprise them. I think it was a point that Mr Cameron made towards the end. He would like to be persuaded. Well, I would like him to be persuaded. And therefore, I want to make sure that this fully independent Citizens' Assembly is able to persuade him. And I would encourage members to go and speak to the conveners. They are open to that. They want to do so. And in that regard, the points that Claire Baker raised are very important. There are a whole range of points and very sensible and important points that she raised. Issues such as whether or not these would be taxed or treated as difficult, the payments for benefits, issues of social media, issues of press. I think it is really important those are discussed by the co-conveners with you and with others. They are the people who will answer them. There's very good examples in Ireland to follow. For example, on social media, those who were part of the Citizens' Assembly could not use social media while a topic was under discussion. They were free to do so afterwards, but not while the topic was under discussion. But all the deliberative sessions were filmed, but not the private sessions of discussion. But those who did not wish to be filmed were not put in a position to be filmed. So there's lots of good practice, but I think it's important that that discussion takes place with the conveners, and every party has that opportunity. It was mentioned that there will be an invitation, as I understand it, to parties to nominate somebody for a political panel. That panel will be available to the Assembly, but at the Assembly's wish, not at the politicians' wish, to say what their position is on a whole range of issues. And it is important those are heard. It is important that the views of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and others are heard in that politicians' panel and available to the Citizens' Assembly. Yes, of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. The Minister did say that he would return to the proposal from the Greens before his speech, and in the last couple of minutes, I wonder if he can put on record whether the Scottish Government agrees that that should be mandated by an amendment to the Climate Change Act, for no other reason, to establish the fact that it is the decision of this whole Parliament, not just of the Government.
I was just coming to that point, but I'm happy to do so. I fully agree with that. I understand discussions on that matter have commenced this afternoon and will come to a conclusion. So that is a commitment we have entered into, and we are pleased to do so. And there can be discussions about future Citizens' Assembly. We are open to those discussions. Finally, Presiding Officer, with 1 minute to go, I want to thank Mr Rennie for his commendation of Joanna Cherry. It was touching, to say the least. I think of this day of all days, the entire chamber should commend her. Look at the result in the inner house today. We should be glad that she is a person of such integrity and forthrightness. She says what she thinks. But the proposals that come to this chamber are my proposals. They are... I know I have been very restrained with the Liberal Democrats, and as I have only a minute and 12 seconds left, I want to keep that restraint in hand, no matter the encouragement not to do so. As far as this Parliament is concerned, there is an entirely clear set of proposals. There is an entirely clear remit. There are 2 independent conveners appointed. The process of establishing the membership is underway. I have reiterated all the points in terms of the independence of this Citizens' Assembly in the debate this afternoon. It is really important now that we, in my view, allow our votes to follow our voices. If those people who have spoken this afternoon believe that a Citizens' Assembly is important and useful, if they take the Irish example, which was established in both cases to look at issues within the Irish Constitution, if they believe that we require a different way of doing politics and a different type of debate, then they should certainly support the resolution. If, however, they do not believe that, then I can't imagine why they are pretending to support it, but failing to support it when we put our money where our mouth is. please support the Citizens' Assembly and let it work independently of us so that it speaks the truth to us, which it will do.
Thank you. And that concludes our debate on the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland. The next item is consideration of business motion 18797 in the name of Graham Day. On behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme, can I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one has asked to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 18797 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau motion 18798 on designation of a lead committee. Again, could I ask Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So we turn now to decision time. The first question is that amendment 18778.1 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion 18778 in the name of Michael Russell on the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Or not agreed? We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 18778.1 in the name of Willie Rennie is yes 34, no 86. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 18778 in the name of Michael Russell on the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 18778 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 86, no 5. There were 29 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 18798 in the name of Graham Day on designation of a lead committee be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Alistair Allen on the 10th anniversary of...
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.